This quality training, it's the first session, and I just wanted to go over a couple of things that we discussed in previous meetings to remind you the context of which we're starting these trainings this week. And the first was, if you remember back to the first organizational meeting that we had, we projected out what the development of the technology and the software and the hardware would look like, and the training as we go through time. And at some point we're hoping that all those key components would be ready to implement Kuali. So this week kicks off the development of our staff who are going to be using Kuali, and hopefully that as we continue to develop the software, the staff development will reach the level where we can all use Kuali and make it useful in our day-to-day jobs. The other thing I wanted to remind us of is something we didn't say last time, but it's generally understood with the Kuali community, is unlike the software purchases of maybe the 1970s and 1980s, when we purchase software today, it's more a lease of the technology. We expect there to be bugs and improvements throughout the year, and throughout the years that we use Kuali. And it's not going to be just an off-the-shelf product that we install and it never changes. So as you're going through the training today, you'll notice that we might run into a few bugs, and we're taking notes of those and we're going to fix them. But even after we implement Kuali in June, there's still going to be some bugs that we need to fix periodically. And that's normal in this process of open source, this kind of community development software. So we expect that, and we also look forward to it because it provides an opportunity for us to make enhancements along the way. So this isn't a one-shot opportunity to get the software developed and then we're done with it. We'll continue to develop it even as we implement it and use it over the years. But today we're just kicking off the training on version 3, and that's the version that we're going to implement in June. And we have several presenters who are going to present the usage of Kuali for different areas. And the first person that we have is Damon from the Indiana University.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Damon Dorsey, and I've met many of you before. But just to give you a brief idea of who I am, I do work for Indiana University, and I work in our operations area. So part of what I do is working with, I use general ledger and making sure it balances, correcting any errors that we have, also with our labor ledger, which I'm going to talk about this morning. I've been involved in the Kuali project for about 4 years now, I guess. I think I visited you all several years ago, early on in the process. So it's nice to be back, and thank you for having me back. With the entries, what we send into the labor ledger, and how you can maintain that labor ledger entry data. And as we go through, I'll also touch on some other things, some of which I'm a little less familiar about, and I'll just be upfront with you about the things that I may not know quite as much about it. The labor ledger module does have some connections to things like budget construction. So depending on what other Kuali modules you're using and how you want to use them, that may have some effect on the data that you see. So just an FYI there. I thought we've got a nice good chunk of time. So I thought I would begin by just talking a little bit about the labor ledger itself. What is it? Why do we have a separate labor ledger in KFS? How is it different than the general ledger? I will speak then a little bit about how it interfaces with other KFS modules. If you're interested in using effort certification, it draws a lot of information from the labor ledger. There's some information that's matched up with labor and budget construction information for reportings, lets you do things like maybe report by position. I'll talk in some detail about configuring labor. That is the different roles that relate to the labor distribution module in KFS, what they can do, what sort of powers those roles give users, and also some of the parameters that allow you to configure that labor distribution module to work how you want it to work. I'll demo some of the labor eDocs for you, particularly the salary transfer and the benefit transfer, and talk a little bit about what they're used for, and the steps that you need to take in order to complete those documents, and talk a little bit about some of the labor reports, the sort of online reporting inquiries that you can get to within KFS. And we should have plenty of time as we go through for questions if there's anything that's not clear. And I will at some point hop back and forth a little bit between the slides and the application so I can show you some of the things that I'm talking about. So what is the labor ledger, and why is it helpful? The labor ledger is very similar to the general ledger. It accepts entries, accounting entries that are then saved and you can then query on. Whereas the general ledger might receive inputs from all sorts of places. It might be getting inputs from KFS eDocs. It might be getting inputs from external systems that are feeding your financial general ledger entries into the system. The labor ledger is similar in that it has some entries it's from KFS eDocs. So there are entries within KFS that you can generate using a salary transfer or a benefit transfer eDoc. And those will go into the labor ledger as opposed to going straight into the general ledger. And it's also where you might want to feed your external payroll entries. What the labor ledger really allows you to do is to collect more information about labor than you do about the transactions that are in the general ledger. So you might want to send information like, who is this salary for? What's the employee's name? What's their employee ID in our system? Do they have a position number that this salary or wage is associated with? So the labor ledger actually collects more information than the general ledger if we're just look at the string of information that it collects in terms of the sheer number of fields that are associated with each entry that gets saved in the ledger. So employee, position, things like the pay period that this salary is for, the payroll fiscal year that it's for. So it's all the information that's included in the general ledger string, your account and object code and all that. Regular general ledger entry information, plus additional information that's really specific to labor itself, employee position information, timing information in terms of when the wages that you're posting were actually earned. And what happens is when you pass information into the labor ledger, it records those entries in the labor ledger with all that additional detail. And then if you're doing something like feeding entries in through a payroll system, what the labor ledger will do is then consolidate those entries down, because we're collecting more fields than we do in the general ledger. In the labor ledger, it will then consolidate those down into rows that it can then pass on to the general ledger. Because the general ledger doesn't collect all those additional fields like employee and position and time frame and all that stuff that the labor ledger does. So the entries that we send to the general ledger will be simplified, sort of condensed in a way.
Damon, can you go over the balance slides that you might store in the labor ledger?
Absolutely. In the labor ledger, you could pass in basically the same sorts of balance types that you might pass into the general ledger. Actuals would be, so I'm passing my actual expenses into the labor ledger. Encumbrance entries can be passed into the labor ledger. And then if you're passing encumbrance entries from a payroll system into the labor ledger, then you can do things like look at encumbrances by person. How much do we have encumbered for this person's salary? That information would come from the labor ledger for you. There's also what we call an A2 balance type or an A21 balance type that is specific to labor. It doesn't get passed on to the GL, and a little later I'll show some examples of how that balance type gets used. But basically what it helps you do is maintain the timing of when wages were earned versus when they necessarily hit the ledger, because you might, using eDocs and KFS, go back and do things like adjust salary that was maybe paid to an incorrect place, you want to move it, and that move might happen, a long time after the actual salary expense itself was generated, but we want to hold on to when that salary, what period that salary was actually for. And the A2 entries help you do that. They help you sort of maintain timing for those entries, whereas the actuals are usually just hitting, whatever period is current is where the actuals are posting. The A2 entries get very important when you're looking at other pieces of KFS where timing is very important, like effort certification. When we want to certify the effort that somebody has spent on a project, it's really important that we maintain when that effort actually happened and for what period that money was associated with. Questions so far about that? Does that make sense? What you want to take away from this, I guess, is we're really collecting at more fields in the labor ledger than we do in the general ledger. That information gets sort of consolidated down and passed on to the general ledger. So there are, later on when we look at inquiries, there are labor ledger specific inquiries that will let you look at those entries with that additional detail. Yes?
You had mentioned that on the encumbrance, we can check it at 5%.
Yes.
Can we also do that by actuals?
Sure. Yeah, you can actually look. That's absolutely. That's a very good question. You can look at what you've what your actuals are for a person versus what their encumbrances are, and sort of add those two together and say, well, from now until the end of the year, I would expect to pay this much for this person with what I've passed in. Now, a lot of that information is going to come from an external payroll system. That is, KFS assumes that you're sending in actuals and encumbrances from some external location. And we can talk a little bit more about that and what those entries might look like. I'll be happy to share with you what we do at IU, which I'm fairly familiar with. I have a little bit of a background in our payroll system and worked with some of those systems for a while, so I wouldn't call myself an expert on payroll, but I have a pretty good sense of what we send and what we do with it for reporting purposes.
Is that this is really it comes from external sources. It doesn't mean that the labor ledger will do the calculation.
That's a good point, Keiko. This does come from an external source. I've had several folks ask me questions. Well, how does Kuali calculate, or how does KFS calculate the labor encumbrances for a person? And the answer is, well, it really doesn't. It's relying on you to feed in information about the encumbrances. So when, for example, if you hire somebody into a new position, and when you hire that person, you would want to send encumbrance entries if you want that amount to encumber from your payroll system or from some external system, possibly an HR or payroll system that's going to set up that encumbrance. And then when you pay that person, you'll send actuals entries to the labor ledger saying, well, we paid Bob $1,000, and we also need to reduce his encumbered amount by $1,000. So the labor ledger will collect all this information, and it'll give you access to it. And I'll talk here in a minute about some of the other things that it does. But it is assuming that information is coming from somewhere outside.
So for implementing schools, it right away becomes a conversion task. You have to bring in the original labor ledger information from payroll.
That's right. So when I start to use KFS, one thing I would have to figure out is, well, I've got all this information sitting somewhere else. How do I bring that into KFS? And you'll need to think about the timing of it. Obviously, if I'm starting, mid-year is different than starting at the beginning of a year. You'd have to figure out, what do I have encumbered as of the time I'm moving over? How do I get those encumbrances in the KFS labor ledger? So that's a good point, Keiko. It is something to think about in terms of conversion. And we can talk some more. I'm not too familiar with what you all are doing today, but based on what you're doing today, I may be able to give you a little more detail on how you might feed that in, or what some of the things you might want to consider when you do it are.
And in terms of the balance type, Damon, you mentioned
Yes.
actual A21 and encumbrance. So those are the radio buttons that you see on the label ledger view, right?
Right. Some of the inquiry screens allow you to see to query by different balance types.
You can feed, for instance, budget as well, right?
You can. That's correct, Keiko.
So
I'm
there's
sorry
something
I
that's
didn't mention budget.
Balance types you can really collect them, except that there may not be a view for it.
Pretty much, and I do, now that you mention it, there are even some that will show you budget. So yeah, the balance types by and large are the same as they are in the general ledger, with the one exception being that A2 balance type, which doesn't exist in the general ledger and only sort of exists in the labor ledger to keep that timing of transactions straight. That's a very good point. Thank you, Keiko, for bringing that up. The labor ledger does have processing associated with it. This is batch processing. And it's very similar to the processing that occurs within the KFS general ledger. There's a scrubber process, a demerger process, and a poster process. And I'll explain each of these in a little detail for you. What the scrubber process does for the KFS ledgers, and specifically in this case the labor ledger, is it validates the information that's coming in, because you are feeding likely information from an external system. What the scrubber does is try to match those entries against your chart of accounts and say, well, these are values that I need to have to be able to post these entries that you've sent me. Are these valid? Do these values exist in your chart? So it does things like check the chart of the entry, the account of the entry, the object code, the sub-account, sub-object code, all the things in that string of information that are being fed into the labor ledger that it can verify. It tries to verify. And if it finds a problem, it will pull that entry and it will report on it. And there's some options, there's some parameters that you can play with here, but the demerger piece of this process, it's in charge of dealing with the errors that the scrubber finds. So the scrubber found 2 entries with errors. Then the demerger tries to look and see where those entries exist in the larger context of all the entries that it has. What it's trying to avoid in the general ledger on that side of things is doing things like posting unbalanced entries. It'll try to pull all of the entries for the same document number that are identified as part of the same transaction, so it doesn't end up posting half of a transaction that you've identified as one whole thing. I might have 10 entries that are all related to the same document number, and it will pull them. Now, this is where the labor ledger and the general ledger differ a little. The labor ledger actually lets you say, for certain types of documents, I don't want you to pull everything, even if there are errors, because as an example, at IU, we pass through our payroll entries and we use the payroll ID, the sort of pay run ID, as the document number. So if I have 1 or 2 errors, I don't want to pull the whole payroll. I just want to pull those specific errors and deal with them individually. But there are other cases where if I have something like a KFS EDOC, like a salary transfer, where if that has an error, I really want to pull, I don't want to post part of it, I want to pull the whole thing and find out what the problem is. So these are configurable things, and I'll talk a little later about the parameters. And one of the parameters that's specific to the labor ledger is which document types do I want to pull everything for, which do I not. But the demerger's in charge of doing that, of figuring out, are there other rows in this information that I need to pull out that might be valid, but that I want to pull because they're associated with these rows that have problems. Then once we've been through the scrubber and the demerger, we get a set of entries that the labor ledger has decided are valid and that it can post. And it'll go ahead and post those to the labor ledger in this poster process. When we talk about the general ledger, these processes are a little more involved and do a little more. And partly this is because the labor ledger isn't generating things like cash offsets. This is stuff that the general ledger will do for you. It will attempt to validate that transactions that you passed into it are balanced. And the labor ledger doesn't do that because it's going to, remember, condense those entries and send them to the general ledger anyway. And so the general ledger processes will be in charge of any offsetting that's required. So that's one kind of critical difference between the general ledger and the labor ledger. So we scrub them to find if there are problems. If there are problems, we pull what needs to be pulled and we post what's left. And any errors that are found, and this is pretty standard between labor and the general ledger. There's a process where Kuali puts those errors in a particular file, generates several files that you can look at. And this is part of what I do on a daily basis for IU. If there is something like a labor error, I get, there's a file I can go out and look to. I can see what the entries that got pulled are. There's a report that's generated from the scrubber process that tells you, I pulled this entry because this value was invalid. Here's what the invalid value was. Here's the field that we had a problem with. And then somebody who's well versed in your chart of accounts can take a look at that and figure out maybe what the issue is and what the correct entry should be, and change those entries if however needed and pass them back through. And there's a mechanism for doing that to kind of get those back through. So there's also a reporting component here that's sending information back to you, and a way to correct these. Yeah. Sure.
San Joaquin Delta, they're moving to a new HR payroll system.
Okay.
And they're not sure how that system's going to be able to feed data over to
Okay.
AFS anyway. And I think the labor ledger will be one way to do that.
Okay.
But they're worried about validations like, for example, account numbers coming from the HR system.
Right.
Would that be something that you would catch in this demergent process?
It absolutely would be, Chuck. That's a good point. So as an example, if you sent an invalid account number to the labor ledger in an entry, the labor ledger would identify that as an error when it got to the scrubber. And it would say, I can't post this to the labor ledger because the account's invalid. And then that would fall out in one of these files. I would see a report that says, this entry got pulled because the account number was invalid. And then I could look at that, and there's a document in KFS. It's called the Labor Ledger Correction Process document. And it's sort of a super user kind of document for somebody that you would give access to that document to folks that are really kind of on the front lines of working with your labor ledger. And I could look, if I was that person, I could look and see, oh, this account number doesn't exist. It should really be this other account number. And that labor ledger correction process document actually gives you a nice way to say, basically, here's the file that had problems, here are the entries we pulled. Anywhere where you find account A, replace it with account B. And so it has kind of a nice find and replace sort of function that lets you automate the correction of those, so you don't have to go through and manually change the account number in the actual file itself.
So in a way, if you had, I want to make sure you pursue this because I don't want to miss this point, but
Right.
let's say your payroll office, of course, was more concerned with getting out the payroll.
Absolutely.
Makes sense.
People get a little irritated when they don't get paid.
In some respects.
Yeah.
I don't want to, but just put a dummy account number there, let it get rejected here, let the workflow sort of reverse. Maybe even though it may be a manual workflow, but let somebody from accounting notify them that they're using a wrong account number. Because there won't be that much volume, probably adding new positions on a daily basis or a weekly basis.
Right.
So would that be a way to clean it up? And then
It would be, yeah. If you were, yeah, you could certainly do that. I mean, but it would just give you, I mean, if you're running that batch process every night, then you'd come in the next morning and I would see these are the entries that fell out. I could figure out what they should be. I could do that correction process document, and they are pretty simple to do. I mean, it's something you want to, it takes you a little while to get used to it, but once you've done a few, it's pretty easy to go in and correct a value like account number on those entries that got pulled, and you could repost them that day. Basically, you submit that labor ledger correction process document, and it sends that in for that night, that next night's processing. So you would have, like a 1-day delay between when you originally got the file. We had some errors that night. The next day, I can correct those errors and post those entries, and they'll be in the labor ledger the next day. So there would be a little timing difference, but in terms of getting them in there, that would work just fine. And I do think that's probably going to be a pretty common thing, depending on how much pre-validation your payroll or HR system can do. If you're capable of doing a lot of validation on that side, then great. But if not, the scrubber will do that validation for you. It won't let entries that are invalid post. It'll pull them and kind of hold them for you and let you fix them at that point and send them in. So that does seem like a pretty reasonable solution if you're worried about maybe sending some invalid data from your HR or payroll system. And that's true for other values that are tied to the chart too. If you do something like I got an invalid object code or whatever, it would pull those, and those could be corrected in the same way.
In a way, also, I'll make sure I understand, labor ledger
Sure.
does not care about position number itself, the accuracy of it?
That's true. That's a good point, and this gets a little bit to some of the interaction that labor has with some of the other KFS modules. What the labor ledger really cares about is posting entries to the labor ledger, but it's not really a position maintenance module. There is a position table in KFS, but it assumes that you're managing your positions elsewhere and feeding information into that position table. And then what it allows you to do is to kind of cross-reference the information that you've associated with the position with the entries that you've sent in and said these entries are for position A. So I can then do some reporting to say, well, what's my actual and budget and encumbrance entries related to position A, and who are the people that I've been paying from position A. So the labor ledger will pretty much take anything you send it in terms of position, but what you would want to do is sort of figure out ahead of time, well, here's the position table, here's how we plan to feed it, here's how often we plan to, so come up with some mechanism that's going to work for you in terms of populating that information. But it's really counting on getting that position information in with the string, and that you've defined this position table the way you want it. No, that's okay.
I don't know how you're trading it.
That's okay. I'm happy to discuss. That's okay.
How this now relates to budget construction in relationship to labor ledger from a point of position number.
Right. There's.
More pertinent to.
Yeah. It really is more pertinent to budget construction, because in budget construction, and this is one of those areas where I will divest early on and say I'm far from a budget construction expert, but the way that I understand it, one of the things that you do in the budget construction module, one of the things it allows you to do is to create budgets by position. You can go in, you can see the incumbents that are in a position, you can do things like set salary increases for people in that position by 1%. So you can say, well, these people are getting 2% and these people are getting 3%, and it will do calculations for you in budget construction automatically to create the proper amount of budget for. And so budget construction does leverage position, and I will sort of just say as an aside, position may have some additional features in budget that I'm just not personally aware of, but what position kind of allows you to do then is it's sort of the fulcrum that joins your budget construction information and your labor information together. So you can see, well, here's all the information that we've got from budget construction related to this position, and here's the information that we've passed into the labor ledger also related to that position. So that's going to give you things like mid-year budget adjustments that might relate to particular positions that might come from your HR payroll system. It would be all of your actuals, any encumbrances. So it kind of ties that stuff together. So when we look a little later on at some of the inquiries, you'll see several of them include not just information that's from the labor ledger, but they're also looking at fields that are really coming from budget construction. So you might see things like July 1 position budget amount, and then you would see, the current amount that we've spent for that position and that person this fiscal year, and then the amount that's encumbered. So that's a good question, Chuck. It kind of ties it all together. And Keiko, you have?
Just a comment.
Sure.
When we convert payroll data
Yeah.
to labor ledger, it doesn't validate against position.
That's correct. So it does assume that if you're sending it from your payroll or HR system, that's the sort of system of authority in terms of position numbers.
So that means that if you're going to down the line use a budget construction and that has something to do with the position, the conversion process has numbers that are correct.
Right.
Because the database does not enforce it.
That's right. And actually, you will have entries that go into the labor ledger that maybe aren't associated with a position, especially if you're doing things like pooling benefits. You know, I'm sending pooled benefit entries into labor. Those necessarily won't be tied to a person or a position. It might just be tied to, you know, an accounting string. So the labor ledger doesn't really validate the position number. That's a good point, Keiko. So yeah, it is something you would want to look at, and you know, it would be good to look at what kind of position information you're collecting and maintaining. You can sort of look at the table that's in KFS now for positions, and then I'm sure somebody who knows more about budget construction than I do could give you a little more information about how it leverages that table and what fields, if any, connected to the position it's actually using, or if it's just using it again as a reference and assuming that you're populating the table the way you want it, and it's just using that position number as kind of a way to tie them together.
Are you, Damon, you are replacing the position data every month, or how often are you refreshing the data?
Well, we get, I'm not sure it's nightly, but it's more than monthly. I would say it's probably somewhere between nightly and once a week is when we update that information, because we actually get nightly feeds from our HR payroll system. And I'm not sure if all of those include position or if position only gets updated once a week. I think it may be once a week for us.
Because when you look at the table itself, it looks like your PeopleSoft table.
Yeah, it really is. And you know, just a little history on that. We did actually used to maintain position data in our financial system, and our HR payroll people said, we don't want you to do that anymore. This is really our data, and it belongs in our system. So you keep the table over there for what you need it for. We'll feed you that data, but in terms of when people need to do things like set up a new position or change the values that are associated with the position, that's not really a financial. We don't want them in the financial system. We want them in the HR payroll system, where we've got some additional control over that, and we can apply our logic to that without having to work through your financial system. Is that similar to how it is here? Is that you have okay, to have that position management actually take place in your HR
Well,
payroll?
in conjunction with finance as well.
Okay. Okay.
Sharon handles all of our position control here, so
Okay.
that they're going to be working in tandem. But as far as creating the positions and so forth,
Yeah.
that'll be over at HR.
Okay.
And then we'll assign the account numbers to them.
Okay, and so there's a funding component to it. Yeah, and it's kind of similar for us. We have, you know, the business of creating a position and hiring a person into it all kind of takes place on the HR side, and we've got where we associate that with accounts, and you know, for funding information, we also ask that they seek the same kind of approvals that we seek for financial transactions. It just kind of happens in that system instead of actually happening in the financial system. Sure. Okay. Hey, I got a lot of mileage out of that slide. That was well, here's our friend, the A2 balance type. So just to go into a little more detail about this. This is the one that only gets used on the labor ledger side, and it preserves the timing of when an entry was originally posted. Are you all going to use the effort certification module? Okay. So one of the things that effort certification, that module does, is it goes out and says if you need to create effort reports, let's say I'm reporting effort for January 1st through June 30th for academic positions or professional positions, one of the things that it will do is it will go out to the entries in the labor ledger and say, well, how did you pay this person from January 1st to June 30th? And using that information from the labor ledger, it will then sort of convert that into percents. It'll say, well, you spent, you know, they were funded 50% from this account over this period of time and 50% from this other accounting string over that period of time. And it uses the A2 entries in the labor ledger to determine whether the salary and wages that it's looking at really occurred within the reporting period. Because you could have situations where you this is pretty common. We might have a payroll at the end of the month where the work happened this month, but we don't actually end up posting those entries until the next month. But for things like effort reporting, it's important to us to preserve the month that was associated with that effort being earned, regardless of when we actually got it posted. And so the A2 balance types help do that. And when we look at the KFS eDocs, we'll see that they generate both actual entries and A2 entries. If you're used to looking at KFS financial documents and you go in and look at the entries that are generated from a labor document, you go, wow, there's a lot of entries. Normally for a financial document, it's a fairly, if it's a simple document, a kind of tiny list of entries. But for labor documents, because there are all these additional A2 entries that get generated, it looks a little more complex, and it's just trying to preserve that timing for you. We've already talked a little bit about how some of the other modules interact with labor, but just to kind of recap at this point, since we've talked about some of the main things that the labor ledger does, the general ledger will receive those consolidated entries from labor. It'll kind of condense them down to basically the accounting string. So if I've got debits for one accounting string, and those might be 100 entries in the labor ledger, it could condense those down into a single entry on the GL side. And budget construction, again, as I mentioned, budget construction, especially through that connection to the position number, if you're feeding in labor ledger information with the position number and you've got information in budget construction associated with that position number, then a lot of the KFS reports that we see later on allow you to do things like query by position number or see all the position numbers associated with a person, and we get a connection to that module as well. So labor is kind of interesting. It's one of those modules that doesn't really stand by itself. It's feeding things to the general ledger. It's accepting things from an external HR payroll system. It's kind of a middleman in some ways, but it does allow you to maintain that detail information for labor at the same time.
Damon?
Yeah,
So
Jerry.
I'm in the general ledger.
Sure.
And I'm not looking at the accounting stream where I'm in an account and I drill down, I look at one of my accounting strings in there. So what I'll see as a user out there would be just payroll.
Right. You would see.
No detail.
Right.
Made that up. Would I be able to?
You should be able to drill from there into the labor ledger and see the entries on the labor ledger side that made that up. So oftentimes I get questions from people, why is the amount of payroll I paid for this biweekly payroll seems to have bumped up. Why is that? Well, it's not going to be readily apparent from the general ledger because we're lacking all that detail information. But if you drill into the labor ledger from there, you should be able to see the entries that are associated with that particular GL entry.
I think it's possible to feed the details. I did that by mistake. Every transaction at the detail level, because I had some reference numbers in the labor ledger side that would not collapse into 11-digit level. I can't remember what I because
Yeah.
I didn't change the email at the time.
Yeah, and there's and I could get it for you too. There's a set list of like 22 things that it checks, and if these 22 things in the row are the same, it collapses them when it sends it to the general ledger. So it is possible to, if any one of those 22 things is different in what you're sending, you could end up getting, basically passing into the labor ledger and passing the same thing on into the general ledger.
So, conversely, if that's your preference, it's possible. Of course, you probably
Yeah.
can't do that if you're writing the labor ledger module.
Right. The nice thing about the labor ledger is it gives you that connection, but it also keeps keeps the number of just sheer entries in your general ledger down a bit, because some of that, a lot of those labor ledger entries, it's
During the conversion period, you can kind of see if everything went over there.
Right.
from the labor ledger side to the
Yeah.
general side.
And you've got that list, right, Keiko?
Yeah,
The
I do.
22, I couldn't name them off the top of my head if my life depended on it, but there is a sort of a set number of things that it checks to do this consolidation. And
It's currently right now, we get full audit, so all journals get loaded by line.
okay.
Not by total.
Okay.
But that was just a decision of,
Yeah.
once, because our end users were used to looking at their account string, their, the one account string.
Yeah.
And seeing everything listed there.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, you, like Keiko said, you could certainly
Be happy just to see just the one payroll.
choose to do that. It would, it would make, it does seem to make people who are trying to learn how to look at their accounts and understand where that information comes from, it's a little easier of a learning curve to say, oh, that's all payroll. And then they call the next week and go, but wait, I need to know who was paid. Where's that at? So to be able to then get to the labor ledger information from there. So you'd have all the information, even if you're doing this consolidation, it would just be a matter of you'd be pulling that information from labor instead.
We can customize what information we see posted.
Yeah, depending on what you want to send, yeah, in that string. If you decide that, well, we're going to send, when we generate these entries, we're going to assign these values in a particular way that would cease that or limit the way that it does that consolidation. So you could look at the string of fields that are consolidated and decide, well, and kind of work backwards from there and say, well, what do we have that we might be passing in from payroll for these values? Do we want it to pass in a common description so that more consolidation happens? Do we want to make them individual so less consolidation happens? So yeah, you could certainly look at that and kind of figure out how much you want based on the information that's passing in. And as Keiko has proven, you can do pretty much a one-for-one if you want. I mean, what we do, to give you a little perspective on what we do is we pass them through with, we send through fairly generic descriptions, and we try to consolidate as much as possible because we just wanted to keep it as lean and mean in the GL balances as we could, and send people over to the labor side to get all the detail. But it certainly either way would be valid depending on what you wanted people to see or where you wanted them to see it.
What kind of users have access to labor ledger?
Any of our financial system users at IU would have that access. So anybody who we give access to the system, once you're over that hurdle, we don't put another internal check in place for us to keep you from that. Now obviously we've stopped sending anything that would be, Social Security numbers or anything like that we would worry about. But I have gotten questions in the past, and I know that not everybody certainly does it that way. But and some users are surprised to see that you can get to all of our labor ledger information. But we've, for whatever reason, over the years, erred on kind of an openness once you get into the financial system. So we lock it down, but once you're in, we have an open general ledger in the sense that I can look at your account and you can look at mine. And so one of the things that, and I don't know how, I'm sure you all probably do something similar, but we require folks to sort of pledge that any information they're pulling out of there is for, in the pursuit of their job duties and not because I want to see what Sam in the other department gets paid or how many vacation hours he took, if I'm getting that kind of a level of detail in the labor ledger. But it's certainly something to think about in terms of who would be able to look at what. And Keiko, you could probably, is that one of the things that the security module that we've talked about in the past would kind of be concerned with, is doing more sort of row level security for KFS, where you could say, well, then in that case you couldn't look at an account that you didn't have some kind of pre-authorization for. But the default for us at IU is we let it be open and count on folks.
Is that an issue if you're gonna have a labor ledger to limit the access?
Yes, right now it's currently limited right now.
Based upon a Damon and I were looking at, Kim yesterday, but right now, Kim is not at that level, so we have to develop a security module.
Yeah.
It's there, but then we have to build a hook
Yeah.
inside the CAFAS to get that happening.
Yeah, Kim is the Kuali identity management piece, and it's kind of, it's new for 3.0, and it does kind of serve as kind of lays the groundwork for additional security restrictions, because it does basically say this person can do these things and has, these responsibilities and permissions associated with them. So it's kind of the basis for that, and right now it's just kind of replicating the sort of permissions that we had in previous releases of KFS. Yes, bless you. But the hope is that would make like the security stuff that Keiko's talking about a little easier, in the sense that the system's already working with that. It would just be sort of building another piece on top of it to do that. So in terms of a little more detail about feeding labor from payroll and HR, I think with some of the good questions we've had, this is all a kind of review for us. But the labor ledger entries that we're sending from a payroll system would be salaries and wages, benefits. There are some benefit tables in KFS that are used by the eDocs. But they're not actually used by the labor ledger. So KFS again assumes that your payroll system or your HR system is the system of record for generating benefit entries. We would get AC, A2, and encumbrance entries, and as Keiko mentioned earlier, budget entries as well, which I've neglected to add to my list, but is true. You could send budget information from an external system as well. But we talked a little bit about position management in relation to Chuck's questions earlier. Again, there's that position table that you would feed. There's some employee status information as well, again, assuming that this information would come from elsewhere or through interactions with the budget construction module. There are things like it's called the Calculated Salary Foundation, or CSF tracker, which is kind of a mechanism to keep the most current information about things like budget and encumbrances for a position. So you have somebody who changes positions mid-year, you would still be able to see through this view the information you had for them before they changed positions, and now what the current information is. So it keeps this and kind of invalidates old records. And so we also get things like, I don't know, I'm not familiar with how much detail you all have on the HR payroll side, but as an example, one of the things that we send through to our labor ledger, and I imagine most folks would be things like earn codes. What am I paying? What is this salary actually related to? Is it regular earnings? Is it vacation or sick time? So if you're recording that level of detail, you could certainly pass those records into the labor ledger, and then you can do things like say, well, what did I pay this person for? In the labor ledger, I paid them for 32 hours of regular time and 8 hours of sick or vacation. So you can pass that information through to that level of detail if you'd like it.
So was all that maintained, is the CF tracker the table you mentioned earlier?
The CSF tracker is another table that's tied heavily to budget construction. But it does pull some information from labor, again, based on position number. So it does things by person and by position. So in that sense, it's related to labor because it's counting on the entries that are in your labor ledger by person and by position to be able to supply some of that information about what we've currently paid this fiscal year for that person, what we currently have encumbered for that person. But I think the actual management of it is through the budget construction module. It's sort of a table that they feed. Keiko, you've gone round and round with CSF Tracker in the past, haven't you? Have you done some?
Yeah, well, all I did was populated the CSF
Yeah.
table, so everything else was calculated outside of the CSF table. So
Right.
my question always was then, for the upkeep of that table, is it like a position data where you would just replace it periodically?
Yeah, and I'm not sure, to tell you the truth, I'm not sure if that happens now with the budget construction module, if that does it for you, because I know when we were looking at it before, it was pre-budget construction. So and every time at IU, whenever I have a question about CSF, I always get shuttled over to the budget office to ask about it. So my sense is either it's populated like the position table externally, or now in KFS tied to budget construction. Yeah. Although
Where
I'm
does that term come from? It's from
calculated salary foundation.
It's very foreign to us.
Yeah, well, and it kind of is to me too. it's basically, yeah, it's a, yeah. Yes, budget has its own sort of language, its own lingo. But what we use it for, I can tell you functionally what I use it for. Often when I want to know if I want to see information for a particular person related to their labor entries, seeing that CSF information is helpful because it tells me things that I might not know just from looking at the labor ledger entries. Like, oh, that person was in that position, and now that position row's been invalidated in the CSF tracker, which would lead me to believe that something on the HR payroll side, they changed positions, they were hired or changed, and now I've got new information. So it does help give a context if you're updating that CSF information to see, well, somewhere along the line these CSF rows have been invalidated, and now I've got this new one. So I would assume the new one to be the where we're going to pay that person now, given information that's feeding over from HR payroll.
So is that where you would assume that if that row was deleted, then there's another type of funding that's associated with that position?
Exactly,
Or
right.
if there's maybe split funding?
Yeah, you would be able to see split funding. You could see if there were multiple accounts. If I'm funding somebody on 2 accounts, I would expect to see their encumbrance split across those 2 accounts. Maybe if previously they were funded on 1 or from a different position or something like that, I would expect in the CSF tracker to see that previous row still there and visible, but invalidated or inactive in that case. And we can look in a little bit at some of the labor ledger inquiries and see where this CSF term pops up. It's kind of insidious. It pops up in several different places. So I do think that that folks associated with budget construction will probably be able to give you a much more scientific definition. All my knowledge of it is kind of from managing the labor side, and there it's helpful to be able to see whether things have been invalidated there, because I've learned what that means. But in terms of how they actually populate it from their either HR payroll or whether there's something in budget construction that's triggering it, that's where I'm a little shaky myself.
Damon, I always wonder if we can obtain balanced like budget in the labor ledger, and I think I've even tried feeding a budget from labor to
Yeah.
GL,
Yeah.
to have a position data there for baseline and current budget.
Right.
Now, how come that they didn't have the labor ledger view full budget? Was that intended that for the use, or I always wonder, because there's only the AC, A2, and internal encumbrance.
Right. Yeah, I don't think there are other labor reports that should allow us to get budget. Let me hop over here, Keiko, and see. These are, and I'm in, just to let you know where I'm at, I'm in the actual test instance of Kuali, because I know we have some labor data out here. It's a little old. It's from 2007, but we do have some. Let me see if I can find, just to show you a little here. I know this is kind of, I will come back over there and narrate here in a second. As I get this kind of pulled up here. Let's see. This is CSF, where I can do this by fiscal year and by account. Let me show you some of the information that comes back here. Because I believe in some of the labor queries we do see budget by person. But you're right, I don't think there's that option to see it in entry.
Can you make that bigger?
Yeah, let me see here.
Control plus for the old plus, and then how to make that bigger?
Yeah, that worked. So these are people who are paid. Our data is a little squirrely here, so so normally you would have, you know, the person's name here, but you've got sort of the accounting string, the position number, the person. There's a July 1 budget amount. There's a full-time effort quantity for that person, and the CSF full-time employment quantity. These would be, this is basically what I planned on in July 1, and the CSF should be what's current. So if something's changed, like all of a sudden I'm no longer 100% FTE, these CSF amounts should show me the actual updated current information. So here's an example a little further down of someone we had no budget and no FTE information for when we started the fiscal year, but now they've got a CSF amount and an FTE amount, like 27.2%, which is kind of odd, but that basically signals to me that we didn't have information for this person when we started the fiscal year, but now they're set up this way. So I can kind of compare where we were at when we did budget construction versus where we're at now. And if there's no difference, then I just assume that there's been no position or funding changes related to that. Right, no reclassifications. And the CSF funding status code will, it doesn't look like I have any here, but this is one that, that will update if there are changes or rows have been completely invalidated. And a dash just means that all is well. I forget what some of the other values for CSF funding status code here are off the top of my head, but and I'll look at the one that Keiko asked specifically about as well, which was labor ledger entry. Is that right, Keiko?
Right.
Or the labor ledger view, I guess, is what we call it here. This is by person. And I can just tell you for my functional use, this is really the one that I use quite a bit, this one in employee funding. What this will allow me to do is to choose the type of balance that I want to see for this particular employee and fiscal year. You can choose to, a lot of these queries allow you to do these next two things. You can choose consolidation or detail, which are really only helpful if you're using sub-accounts or sub-object codes. It lets you consolidate all that information into one set of numbers or view the details for that particular set of numbers. You can also choose whether or not you want to see entries that are considered pending. Mostly for labor, the pending entries would be things like from salary transfer documents, stuff that you're moving around within KFS, because you're probably not feeding pending entries into labor, you're just feeding the actual labor entries that you have and posting them. And what happens here is for that particular person, you get the accounting string, the position number, and you get sort of monthly buckets that show you what's happened. So in this case, I asked for actuals for this particular employee, and I can see they were paid on this accounting string and associated with this position number, these amounts in these different months, and then could drill down into these individual months to get to the more detailed entry information. And we have some other buckets up here. The annual line balance amount just summarizes how much is all these numbers add up to here. If you happen to have a beginning balance amount when you start a fiscal year, which would probably be a little uncommon in labor, except for maybe contract and grant accounts that you want to carry forward things like previous year balances for actual, so you can kind of keep a inception to date total for things if you have a project that needs that. Let's see if I can drill down here just to show you the labor ledger entries. So this is the whole entry, and if you're used to in KFS seeing general ledger entries, mostly the string is pretty much the same. You get your whole accounting string. Things start to sort of break down around here and get a little different. You get your position number, which is specific to labor. description we've kind of X'd out here. Most of this other stuff is the same, but then we get out to pay period, end date, transaction total hours. These are all things that are very labor specific. These fields don't really occur or don't really appear in the general ledger. So employee ID, pay group, earn code. If you want to send, I mentioned earlier things like this is for regular salary versus sick time or vacation time. You can send in different rows for those. And some of these are just based on things that we had in the IU data. Like, you know, we assign a grade and a salary administration plan that kind of tells us this is an academic person with this particular grade. It's kind of a pay grade. The run identifier that's a payroll run ID, so it's a number that just gets fed over from the payroll system. But to get back to your original question, Keiko, I really don't know why there's no budget. Why you can't, it would actually be a good enhancement, I think, just to have that be a regular balance type field rather than radio buttons. Because you're right, we could see budget transactions in that monthly bucket kind of layout.
That, we were not supposed to use budget or not. I know internal encumbrance just got added. It wasn't there in the 2.2 either.
Yeah.
Yeah, we only have the A2 and what's the other one? Astral. That's all we
Yeah.
have.
Yeah.
And IE got just added.
Right. Well, I think it may be because I think at least for us, I don't know that we feed a lot of budget into the labor ledger. Really, we do our budget adjustments. If we have to do them, they go directly into the general ledger. And I think maybe the only time that we touch budget information is during budget construction, where we associate it with a position, and then throughout the year we make adjustments to the actual general ledger. But again, that kind of ties back into the CSF information, and I'm not quite sure if budget construction is now leveraging that
Yeah, but
piece.
If you don't have a position of control in Kuali to do a calculation, yeah, why should it go through labor ledger, I guess? Why
Right.
should it do a pass-through, right?
Right, because you're just going to send them through and consolidate them down and pass them to the general ledger
So that might be
anyway.
why.
Yeah. And we'll go back and look a little more at those reports, but it would seem like a good place to show you some of them and some of that additional data that was available there.
So just a quick question
Sure.
on that, the line, you don't have to jump back to it.
Sure.
But where it said earn code, RGA.
Yeah.
So if somebody was paid and if we wanted to do an analysis on how many overtime hours a particular account was absorbing.
Right.
I would expect to see different line items.
Yeah, so we would use, as an example, we've got an earn code called OVT for overtime. So I could pass through that, we paid Bob 40 regular hours and 2.5 overtime hours on this accounting string. And then you can go out and run reports. If you want to run reports out of your data from the labor ledger and say, show me, this set of accounts and all the labor ledger entries that were associated with that overtime earn code. Yeah, so that would be certainly one thing to do. We pass through, and I'm sure this is my only payroll experiences with PeopleSoft on the IU side, but we do, different earn codes for regular earnings and things like overtime, sick time, vacation time, funeral. I mean, they get very specific. So you could get a real, I guess it's, however specific you are going in, you could get coming out and get that association with the accounting string if you wanted. Yeah.
For each position, whether it be hourly, let's say faculty hourly, they all have to be assigned position sequence number.
If you want to use position in your reporting, then yes, I would say you want to send through that position number because it's going to be another piece of leverage that you have against the data later on. Again, I can only kind of speak from IU's experience on this side. We do what we call pooled positions for hourly employees. So several employees might have the same position number, but I think that's there's no requirement to do that, and I'm sure other people do it different ways and in different places. But But yeah, it does seem like in order to be able to leverage that data, you would want to send that position number through. And it sounds like that would be a good idea for the kind of reporting. Just from some of the questions that you all have asked, it seems like that would be a nice piece of data to be able to leverage against, especially as a nice cross-reference then back to your HR payroll system. Just make it a little easier to bridge back between the two. Talk a little bit about some labor parameters. Are you all familiar with what the parameters are in KFS and what they're there to do? Should I talk a little about that maybe? Okay, there's well, early on, a little background here. There were a lot of business rules in the FIS system that were hard-coded. And one of the things we realized early on in the Kuali project is we got to get these out where people can change them, because other institutions are going to have different business rules and want to configure things a different way. And we struggled with this for a little while and came up with this idea of parameters. So there's a parameter component in KFS. Let me hop back here and just show you where it is. If you're not familiar with it, it's on the administration tab in KFS. And it's in this configuration channel here, this little box, and it's just called parameter. And there are different parameters for different, we call them namespaces, but really functionally you can kind of think of these as modules. So there are some parameters that only apply to particular types of activities in KFS, and then there are some that are kind of system level parameters, and somewhere down here there's a KFS sys one that are things that maybe aren't specific to a particular module but are kind of global. There are some other ones out here for things like Kim that Keiko mentioned earlier and workflow, but labor has some as well. So if I go out here to labor distribution, say, well, show me the parameters for KFS LD for labor distribution, I can search here and see these parameters. And the idea was that we would give these parameter names to kind of describe what they are. They do have descriptions. I've kind of blown it up to make it a little easier to see here, so the description's hanging off to the right here. There's a component that sort of tells you, well, what part of labor does this parameter really impact? So you can see, like, here's one that says this is specifically associated with the labor scrubber. Here's our description, kind of hanging out here. And then the parameter has values, which are really where you do kind of the customizing. This is where you flip things to yes or no if they're sort of on or off switches, or add in values if it's things like, hey, I need to know what account number you want me to use when a particular thing happens. So let me look at just one of these so I can give you, I'm going to sort them by component here just to see what we've got. These are some that we're using for some reports that are being released for 3.0, some labor balancing. We tried to automate in 3.0 some of the balancing reports to kind of do things for you. So these are kind of new, so I'm going to skip those for now. This is a good example, sent to GL balance type. So here's a parameter that just says, these are restricted balance type codes for posting into the GL entry during the labor poster process. So these are things that, entries that are going into the labor ledger that we don't want sent on to the general ledger. And they're defined by balance types, and the parameter value in this case tells us what is the value that we don't want sent. So it's A2, those A2 entries, we don't want those in the general ledger because they're really meaningful for the labor ledger and aren't going to do us any good over there. But you could configure that if you decided to change the name of the balance type or add additional balance types maybe for some reason that you want to pass in to labor, but you don't want to go on. So the parameters allow you to make pretty simple changes, and changes that a functional user could make, in the sense that these are driven by a document. I don't have to go out into code or into a table and kind of yank things out and change them. I can flip things here in the parameters and get some change in the system without having to spend a developer's time to do that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the parameters that are in labor and how they work. So what I've done here just for the slides is I've kind of divvied them up by component, by sort of the piece that they refer to in labor. So I mentioned these labor balancing reports. One thing that we had in KFS 2.2 is a lot of sort of what I would call ledger reports. They're reports that come out of the batch process and say, hey, here's how many entries came into the scrubber, here's how many went out, here's how many errors we found, here's how many we demerged, here's how many we posted, and also include things like balance summaries, so you can make sure that, well, where I was at yesterday plus what went in last night equals where I'm at today. But it was kind of assumed that would be a manual process. I spend personally about an hour and a half every day, just kind of going through ledger reports and making sure that things from last night, get corrected if there were errors. Or part of it is just kind of manually balancing numbers to make sure that we are where I think we should be. So for 3.0, we wanted to try to automate some of that and make some summary reports. So there are a couple parameters, and I'm not sure we've got all of them out there yet that we will have, but these do things like tell you, how many fiscal years do you want us to include when we automate this balancing? When you cross over to a new fiscal year, you might want to keep doing the one that just ended and start doing the new one, and then stop doing the fiscal year that's ended a little ways out. So it lets you sort of configure how wide a net those automated balancing reports cast. There's labor scrubber logic that allows you to figure out how KFS is going to deal with accounts not accepting fringes or accounts not accepting wages. Do you all have this situation where you have certain types of accounts that you don't really want to allow people to post wages or fringe benefits to? KFS has a couple ways. They're kind of outside of labor, but there are places where you can kind of restrict this. For example, when you set up an account in KFS, one of the things you can do is say whether or not it accepts benefits. And if not, you can define a benefit account. So any wages that are posted to this account, the benefits need to get shuffled off somewhere else. It has a similar option for accounts not accepting wages, and this one is a little different. You can actually set it up to either be an error in the scrubber to say you can't post wages to that account, or you can set it up, there's a suspense account where you can say if somebody tries to charge wages to this account, what you need to do is send it to this predefined suspense account, and we're going to look at it and figure out what they were doing and where it really belongs. So there are parameters that allow you to kind of set that up with the suspense account. And also, we have the ability in both the labor scrubber and the general ledger scrubber to deal with expired accounts and continuations. When an account expires in KFS, it forces you to put in a continuation account, and the labor ledger can do continuation account logic in the scrubber for you. So if your payroll system sends it an expired account, it can go out to the chart and say, hey, the continuation account for this is this account number. It also lets you exclude certain types of transactions from this logic if you want to. So there are parameters that allow you to do that, to sort of customize that continuation account logic a little bit. There are, as we saw, labor poster parameters that let you exclude entries that are going to the GL. You can also choose, although we're still puzzled by this one internally as well. There's a parameter for object codes not posted to the labor ledger. This would be, and it may go away unless somebody can come up with a great use case for it, because it's one of those things that we sort of found in code and got slavishly converted, and now we're like, why would we want to do this? But it's if you're sending entries into the labor ledger, you can actually specify object codes that you don't want to post to the labor ledger. But that's kind of an odd thing to do because then they'll never go anywhere. I think it would only be if for some reason you're getting a feed that's much larger than what you want and you wanted to trim it down, but I don't know. That one doesn't make sense to me, so I think it may go away unless we can find out if somebody requested it or wanted it. There are ways, and there are similar ones in the GL, to purge entries and to purge balances after a number of years. If you want to purge those out of the tables, maybe you've copied that data off somewhere else and you just want to purge it out of the KFS tables, you can. I guess if space becomes an issue for you. And there are some for year end that define what types of balance entries you want to carry forward. This would again be if for contract and grant accounts as an example, if I want to carry forward balances from labor into a new fiscal year for a particular set of accounts, parameters allow you to do that. And we can talk a little more, and we've talked a little bit about parameters here and there. Any of these that strike you as odd or you wonder what that's about?
We don't have a job today, right? So we just have to kind of come up with our own.
I think, let's see.
There isn't,
I think so. Let's look. I think labor purge balance step and labor purge entry step.
oh. Right.
Yeah.
Purge date from labor, that's a parameter. And then you have a job that may purge job.
Right. There should be a purge job.
And does archive off, I've never tested this job.
We tested it for 2.2. I haven't tested it for 3.0.
Oh, so it was there in 2.2, I didn't
I think so. I think the purging parameters were there previously. But yeah. Oops. Uh-oh. Network timeout. Let's see if I'm... My IT guy at home has me trained well. Whenever something goes wrong, he says, just try it again. Turn off. Have you turned off your computer? If you restarted your machine.
Those are standardized.
You know, it's what's really amazing is people say, well, Damon, how did you fix that? I'm like, I just turned it on and turned it off and turned it back on. And 90% of the time it works.
That's what my standard response is. I've already turned it off, I've already turned it off. Before I even
Exactly,
say anything,
right.
don't need to tell me that.
It won't even call if I haven't turned it off and turn it back on, because I know I'm going to be hanging up and turning it off and turning it back on, and that's okay. I'm not quite sure what happened to my connection here. Let's see.
I just lost it too.
Did you?
But I was in the Delta.
Okay.
near Kuali.
We do. I can try to connect here again in a second because I think I am going to go in and show you some more stuff. I'm getting towards the end of just covering sort of the overview stuff. There were a couple parameters lurking on my next slide here that I missed. There are some that pertain specifically to the salary expense transfer, and this is just a KFS EDOC that lets you kind of shuffle salary and wages around within the labor ledger after you've already posted them. And one thing that occasionally happens is you might end up, when a salary expense transfer moves salary, it also moves associated benefits. So it figures out there are benefit tables that you can maintain that say, well, I paid this guy $100 and I pay it for salary, and I paid him an additional $30 for benefits in these different object codes. And that information came in from payroll. And when I do something within the system, like, well, he got paid on the wrong account, so I want to move his salary over to another account for that particular pay, what the salary transfer will do is it will also say, well, you also paid benefits for him, and I know how much, based on this percentage of benefits, I'm going to move the correct amount of benefits at the same time. And there are certain users who are authorized. You can authorize users to do things like change object codes on salary transfers. Usually a no-no and kind of locked down. But if you give certain users that power, what can happen is you can get into a situation where we paid him on this code and it calculates benefits at this percentage. I'm going to move him to another object code and it calculates at a different percentage. So I end up with kind of this mismatch of I started out with this much salary and benefits, and I'm moving, and benefits are either increasing or decreasing. And there's a parameter that allows you to define a clearing account for that excess, for any amount that's over or under for benefits, and then you can kind of keep an eye on that account and see what happens with it. So that's a parameter. We'll also allow, if you do decide to use the effort certification module, effort has some logic that will kind of lock down some pieces of labor. When you're doing something like, I gave the example earlier of using or creating an effort report for a faculty member that starts January 1st and ends June 30th. This is their effort for that period, and that effort report routes and people certify it. They can make changes to that effort report, and if they make changes to the effort report, what happens is it generates a salary transfer back and makes any adjustments to the labor ledger that's needed. But what you don't want generally people to do is, while that effort report is routing, you don't want people to be able to go in and do salary transfers and mess with the labor ledger entries that were used to create that effort report. So what effort certification does when you're using it is, if there's an open effort report for that person that involves those periods, it will stop you from doing a salary transfer that involves those periods. It'll just say, this is pending an open effort report and changes can't be made. There is a way to, there's also, so you can actually turn this off and on. Why you wouldn't want it on if you're using effort certification reports, I don't know, because it's a really handy feature. You don't want things to get out of sync. You can also give certain authorized users the ability to override this edit, which sometimes happens if you get, I know for us it occasionally happens when effort reports were generated and we had a salary transfer that was already sort of in process and en route at that point in time, and I need somebody who can go in and take some action on that to clear that up. Keiko, you look like you have a question. You're just, okay. We mentioned Kim earlier, and this is just kind of a quick overview for you of these, but Kuali Identity Management allows you to set up roles and to assign roles to individuals, and that gives them the ability to take certain actions, certain permissions, and also sets them up in the workflow to receive documents for approval. So I just wanted to run through some of the roles that are kind of default roles that are out in the Kuali data, and you can customize roles to a pretty large degree, but just out of the box sort of here. Most KFS users, if you're just a KFS user, you can initiate certain documents like a salary expense transfer or a benefit transfer. There are also some year-end versions of these documents, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. So these are just, again, for kind of shuffling labor information internal once you've fed it in. So, hey, that was paid to the wrong account. I need to move it to another account. So most users can do those. There are some other documents that are locked down more. There's a labor ledger journal voucher document, a labor ledger JV document that's kind of relegated to a system manager role. So you figure this would be a smaller group of people, and this would actually let you go in and make pretty much any adjustment to the labor ledger that you want. It doesn't have to balance like other eDocs do. You can do debits or credits. You can do different balance types. You can choose the posting period that you want it to show up to. So it's a pretty potent document. I can tell you just in reality that IU doesn't have this document today, so it's kind of a new one for us. We wanted one for KFS, but we haven't. It hasn't been one that we had to have, but it could be handy if for some reason you had problems with a feed and wanted to manually put entries in. You could do it with the Labor Ledger JV. The other document that I talked about a little earlier in terms of working with the scrubber and fixing errors and things was the Labor Ledger Correction Process document. This is the one that is even more restricted. It's again, this operations group is kind of a smaller role in general. But this is the document that lets you pick up error files that fell out of the scrubber and say, this account value is bad on all these entries. I want to replace, wherever you find this account in these entries, replace it with this other account number, or change the posting period for these. It's a really potent document that lets you feed things directly back in to the labor ledger. So we go from really kind of general use documents that just being a KFS user kind of gives you permission for, to really potent, basically posting right to the labor ledger documents that are limited to a very small group. Some users have the ability to blanket approve transactions within KFS, which you're probably familiar with if you've messed around with some different users in the test data and things. You'll see this blanket approve button pop up at the bottom of different screens. And the salary transfer document is pretty much assigned to the same group that can normally blanket approve documents, with one addition. If you're using effort certification, one of the things that I mentioned earlier is if you modify an effort report, once that effort report's fully approved, KFS goes back and generates automatically a salary transfer that says, hey, you changed this effort, so I'm going to do a salary transfer to make sure the labor ledger reflects the changes. It initiates that document on its own and blanket approves it, so people get FYIs, but it doesn't route for approval, because really certifying the effort report is what really authorized that particular type of action. So we just give that system user here access to do this. And this is really, when you see system user in relation to roles, it just means that's KFS acting on its own. Sort of, it has a system user that it can go in and initiate documents or blanket approve it based on code that exists in the system. So really specific to effort reporting in that particular one. We do, I mentioned earlier, have some folks who can modify object codes on the salary expense transfer document. So most users can just move it from one place to another, but can't really change the object code to say it's really a different type of salary or wages than I thought it was. The role that does this out of the box is the contract and grant processor, because we found in that area that was really where this need came from, was in terms of working with grant accounts. But again, these permissions, you can tie them to different roles if you'd like, if it makes more sense for your implementation. And the same for overriding that restriction that I talked about when you're trying to do a salary transfer document for an effort report that's for a particular period. It's got that period locked down. There's a contract and grants manager role that can do that. So again, both of those requirements on the salary transfer kind of came from the grant side, so that's how they ended up in those particular roles. But you could decide if you wanted at your institution to have other users to have access to those permissions. You could certainly do that and create different roles or assign those permissions differently. But just kind of an overview of some of the different permissions that are associated with labor and the roles that have them kind of by default. Okay, let's talk. How are we doing so far, everybody? Okay? Okay. I'm okay if you all are. Let me see if I can get reconnected here. That's my... I'm going to talk a little bit about the salary expense transfer, and I'd like to show you. If you'd like to, you can certainly follow along. I'll be in the KFS test instance here, where I know, as I mentioned earlier, that we have some labor data. But I wanted to talk in some detail about the documents, especially the salary expense transfer and the benefit transfer. We use the salary expense transfer just to correct the distribution of salary expense in the labor ledger and the general ledger. Again, anything that happens in the labor ledger, it'll condense down and pass along to the general ledger. If you're familiar with financial processing documents, the salary expense transfer is very similar to the general error correction, which is just a document that we use to move stuff from one place to another, sort of set up in this from and to configuration with a couple sides to it. So the idea being, I'm going to go out and grab this salary expense from wherever it's sitting, and I'm going to move it somewhere else. It's a little different than other documents in the sense that a lot of KFS documents you can just go in and you enter the accounting string yourself and the dollar amount and add the row, and KFS lets you go on. For salary expenses, we want to make sure that the person is actually grabbing a salary expense that exists in the labor ledger. So we actually send them to the labor ledger to pick entries to move. So it's a little more involved than some of the financial processing documents where a user's just kind of entering data into fields and then adding a line. So you can select the balances that you want to modify by fiscal year. So choose what fiscal year these hit, by the employee ID, the account, the object code, position, and accounting period. So you get pretty specific in terms of grabbing these balances. And I'll show you how this works when we select a balance and pull it forward to be edited on the document. And there's sort of a check on the document that makes sure that you're not moving more than that. You can move less than that. So maybe I paid somebody $2,000 in a month on the wrong account, and really it should have been split 50-50 between two accounts. So when I go in to do the salary expense transfer, it'll pull in the full amount they got paid, and then I can edit the amount down to just the amount I want to move. So in that case, I would change it from 2,000 to 1,000 because that's the amount that I want to actually move. And there's an edit check in place there that just won't let me move more than that. So I could change 2,000 to 1,000, but I couldn't change 2,000 to 2,500, or I couldn't move 3,000. So it uses that number as the ceiling, and it'll let me move any amount under that. It'll also let me move multiple accounting periods. So if I want to move salary from March and February and January for the same person all on the same document, I can do that. Yeah.
I just have a quick question.
Sure.
So when you have balances to be modified must be selected by, that's not fiscal year and employee ID and account. You could do like fiscal year and account and all the employees that fit that criteria, correct?
Actually, it is all of those together because right. So if I have two employees and I want to move their salary, I would have to do two salary transfers. They are specific to employees, and part of that ties back to well, some of it just ties back to effort certification. This idea of one document for one person, and I'll show you how you can do it. You could certainly do multiple accounts on the same document, but for one fiscal year and one employee is kind of the required, right? Those two, and yeah, multiple accounts, multiple object codes, multiple positions or accounting periods can all be moved. That's a really good question because my slide's kind of unclear on that point. So fiscal year and employee ID are what I really have to go in and grab, and then it shows me all the labor entries for that particular person, and then I can kind of pick and choose whatever I want. It's a very good question. Thank you for making me clarify that. It's a little tricky there. I mentioned earlier that benefit entries automatically get moved at the same time that you do salary and wages, and I'll show you how that works. How does it calculate that stuff? What does it use? It's all kind of table driven in KFS. Okay. I'll find the salary expense transfer. It's in, if you're looking for one, they're on the main menu, and they're under transactions, and there's a little labor distribution group down here that includes the salary expense transfer and the benefit expense transfer. A little hint if you want to play around with this with the data that's out in test. Most of our labor data out there is in fiscal year 2007. They just haven't updated it. So if you're having trouble finding labor balances to transfer around, you can try modifying that fiscal year, and that should get you some data. So here's our salary expense transfer. It looks real similar to other KFS documents. It's got a document overview section where we can put in a description and an explanation. It'll calculate an amount up here for us once we've completed it all. What's a little different, if I go down here, you can see it's got an accounting lines tab, but it's not really editable. I can't go in and just start entering stuff here. I have to work with this labor balance or this ledger balance importing tab to pick the salary expense that I want to move. So as we mentioned earlier, it's by fiscal year and employee ID. So I'm going to specify here fiscal year 2007, and I happen to know somebody that has some balances is 6 zeros and 1, 2, 3 zeros in employee ID. If I didn't, there's a lookup here. I could go out and search. But so when I've got the fiscal year and the employee ID entered, I can search. And what it's going to do here is actually take me out to the labor ledger balances. And it's going to say, well, what balances do I have for that employee and for this fiscal year? And you'll get this sort of configuration where it tells you, here's the sort of accounting string and the position number for this particular person, and here are the monthly amounts that I have associated with that. And here's another accounting string here, and here are the monthly bucket amounts that I have for that. So the amount charged in November and March and August and all that. So it sort of goes starting from July on through to June, and then a year-end bucket down here as well. So from this point, I could choose anything that has a balance. I can choose to check and move. I'm just going to choose one here for simplicity, but you can choose multiple ones. There's a select all button, I believe, if you're feeling really like moving everything all at once. You can also unselect or return with no value if you think maybe I put the wrong person in. So let's say, let me come up with a scenario here. Let's say that this guy or this person really should have been paid for January and February. This should have been split. This 10,000 that's here, it shouldn't have all been charged to this one 10314000 account. So I want to split it up. And actually, I'm just going to choose 1 month because it'll make our entries a little simpler when we go to look. And as you'll see, even one accounting line on a labor ledger document ends up generating quite a few entries because of benefits, and those A2 entries, you end up with a pretty complex set of entries. So I'll try to keep it simple here and just do this one for February. So we'll say half of that February salary should have been paid on another account. So I'll click the month I want to mess with and say return selected, and it's going to come back and build a from side line for me down here. Now I can keep going back if I want to. I can go back and search and pull in other ones if I didn't get them all. But what it's done here, and I'm going to make this just a little smaller so we can kind of see it better, or at least get the whole line on the screen. So it's pulled in the chart and the account, the object code, the position number, the payroll fiscal year, and the payroll period, the month of that fiscal year that this salary is associated with. So it was associated with the 8th accounting period of fiscal year 2007. There's an hours field here. We don't really feed the hours field. If you did want to feed the hours field, if you had it in your labor ledger, you could feed it and modify it. There's an amount here, and so what it did was basically pull in that full amount that I selected, and it'll let me edit it. But again, I can only go lower. I can't go higher. I could leave it as it is if I want to move the whole amount, but in this case I don't. I only want to move half. So we'll say that's what? We'll cheat and we'll say it's $5,260. That's about half for a guy without his calculator. Without my adding machine, it's about half. Kind of close. So I can change the amount here, and then this to side is down here, and this is usually where people kind of freeze up and they're like, okay, well, what do I do now? I can't get a line on the to side. And what you want to do in this case is there's a button over here. There's actually a couple buttons. There's a copy all button and there's a copy button. And what they let you do is copy the lines that are on the from side over to the to side and then edit them on the to side. If you copy all, that's handy if I've got 2 or 3 things that I'm moving at once, so I just want to copy all those guys at one time. If you've only got one line, like in this particular document, I can just click it right there on the line and copy it over, and it's going to populate that same data on the to side, but you'll notice that a lot more is editable here than was on the from side. So I can't really change where it's sitting right now, but I can change where I'm going to send it. So these fields are editable. I can enter a different account number. Appear to be logged in as somebody who can even edit the object code in this case. which I won't do, but I will go in and change the account number. So I'll say we really wanted to move this amount to this 10-314-20 account. You'll notice my position stays sort of locked down, so it's still associated with the same position. It's not letting me change that, and still earned in the same period, related to the same payroll period. So I'm not modifying that either. Yeah. Not sure.
If you scroll down, do you see what the description of that position is, or do you see a name, or?
I don't hear back on the search screen.
Oh, okay.
If I would have seen the name there, I think we may have
roll to these other
right.
pages.
Yeah, when you roll to these, that's a good point. You don't.
The description of the position.
The position was a hyperlink on the search screen where I could drill in there and see it, but not back here when I pull it in. So if I go back, let me see, it should let me go back to here. Let me search for this guy. So here I can click on the position number and pop that little guy open and get an incident report. So they're apparently not really a position. This is what you would get if you had a position that's not in the position table. So it's basically saying no records found for that particular position. So it looks like maybe our position test data is not quite so cool. But that would pull up a position inquiry. And I can show you the position inquiry here when we look at some of the, yeah.
You would know who that employee ID was, or who that.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, the employee name should show up here. I think what happened is when we went to the Kuali identity management, we don't have the people that we have the old labor data for aren't actually people in the Kuali identity management data. So it's trying to pull a name from that, and it can't find one that matches. So I think this has more to do with the sort of currently squirrely nature of our data.
Yeah, that was keyed on employee ID, huh?
Yeah, and still is, but there's just nobody with that employee ID right now in the data. So, and I know at least for the test instances, they're looking at updating all that data before.
That brings up a good point. During the conversion, we need to make sure that person exists in the table.
Well, sure, right. You would want to feed your person table with all your employees.
Because we used to validate against the universal users table, now we have to go against.
Right. So now you're just validating against a different table. That's right. That's a good point, Keiko. Yeah, you would want that. Oh, I guess I've done a bad thing and returned a line I didn't intend to return. So let me get rid of one of these. And okay, so now I've got my from side and my to side here. I'm moving it to a different account. My pending entries here in a second will show me, once I submit this, what all we're actually moving. Nothing there just yet. I'm going to go ahead and submit the, oops, it's going to squawk at me because I forgot to fill in my description. My contract and grant people would scream at me if they saw me use this. You're restating what the document does. You can't do that. I need to know why. But we'll cheat today and say we have a really good reason. Just not type it. So let me go ahead and submit this guy. And so it should route the document, and it does all the edit checking here when I click submit to make sure I haven't done something like exceed the amount that was actually sitting out in this particular pay period. So it was fine with that, and we did go ahead and successfully submit my document, and generates what I would call a fair amount of labor ledger pending entries. Considering that we had 2 lines on the document, I end up with about, I think, 24. Yeah, I end up with 24 labor ledger pending entries. So what is all this? Well, we'll take it in pieces here. First, we have the actual entries that I wanted moved on the salary expense transfer. So here, first one says, well, I'm going to credit 5260 off of the account that was sitting on, because I'm moving it off of that. Okay, and then somewhere down here, I've got the corresponding entry for the account that I'm moving it to. So here's the account that I moved it to is 1031420. So that one's going to be debited now. So those just move my salary. Now I've got a bunch of other object codes popping up here as well. And these are related to the salary transfer generating the benefits for me automatically. So we'll see on the 1031400 account, which is where I moved this thing from, I've got also coming off of that account something in object code 5760 in the amount of $371.36. I've got another one down here for 5625 that's similar, another one for 5772. So where do all these numbers come from? This is the benefit calculation in the salary transfer being driven by several different tables. We'll go out and look at them here in a second and figure out where all those numbers came from. But there's a series of tables in labor that support the benefit calculations that things like the salary transfer do. One of them is just called labor object code, and all it is really is a table that says, hey, these are object codes that we're using to identify salaries or fringe benefits, and it just defines them as such. There's another one that defines a set of benefit type codes. These would be things like the different types of benefits that I'm relating to object codes in my system. So maybe I've got one for FICA and one for retirement and one for regular fringe benefits. So it defines these codes for your use in the system. And then we're going to use these codes a little later on here in these other tables. There's one called labor object code benefits. And what this one does is it says when I pay somebody an object code XYZ, here are the benefits that that person gets. Here are the different types of benefits using these benefit type codes they would get. This person would get FICA, they would get retirement, they would get this fringe benefit code. And then there's a labor benefits calculation that assigns an object code and a percentage to each one of these benefit types. And with all that information sort of cross-referencing, it can figure out how to do this. So let's go back and take a look at this. I'm going to open another window so I don't lose my doc there real quick. You can find these guys, these tables, out on the maintenance tab, and there's a labor distribution menu option down here that lists them all. So labor benefits calculation, labor benefits type, labor object code. Let me just kind of run through them real quick for you. The labor object code one, this is the one that I'd mentioned just, and I was moving salary for 2007, so I'm going to use that. And I was moving it from a particular chart. I could just search for all of them, but this one basically tells me that these are salary or expense codes. So one of the object codes that I used was object code 2000. That was where my salary was, and there's a little indicator here that says it's a salary code. There's other information on here, but in terms of benefit calculation, that's really the only one that's important. I'm just defining my object codes as either salary object codes or benefit object codes. The next one I think I mentioned on my slide, let me check here, was labor benefits type. So this is the different type of benefits that you're going to define in your system. So we've got some out here. We've got a retirement one. We've got one for contract and grant retirement, which we charge at kind of a different rate. IU does anyway, have a separate rate that gets charged to departments if they're folks who are being paid on a contract and grant account. So it's an example of a way to kind of split things up. We've got FICA out here, fringe benefits, no benefits, and retirement exempt. And all we've really done out here is define just some basic codes for these B, E, F, G, N, and R, and made them active. This labor benefits retirement indicator, I don't actually think it does anything right now. I think the hope was to leverage it in the future, but I don't think it's actually got any functionality behind it right now. So I've got these different codes defined, and then there's a table out here that says, well, if you're paying somebody on this object code, what benefit types are associated with that object code? And that is going to be labor object code benefits. So if I'm moving salary from fiscal year 2007 and it was on this chart in this object code, show me what kind of benefits I'm looking at. So here, all we get are, if I'm paying somebody an object code 2000, they're going to earn benefits F, G, and R. So I've defined, based on what kind of salary, wages I'm actually paying, what kind of benefits that person will earn. And then, because your benefit rates probably change every fiscal year, there's another table that basically says, well, for fiscal year 2007, how much were we charging for FICA? What would have been charged to their account for FICA? And that's kind of the final piece of this puzzle. So most of these that we've looked at so far are things that you would kind of set up and leave that way and probably just copy over for the next fiscal year. The next one is a table that would probably change with the rates every fiscal year. This one is the labor benefits calculation table. So I now know, I know I'm going to move F, and so now I want to see how much I would get moved for FICA, for F in this case. So I look out and I see that for 2007, F was 7.06% and was being charged to object code 5760. So this is really what the salary transfer is looking at. It's looking at all these tables going, well, you moved object code 2000, and I know I need to move FICA for that. And then it says, well, how much should I generate for FICA to move along with this? Well, 7.06%, and where would I find that? Well, it would be in object code 5760. So it's going to generate additional entries for those. So some of this stuff that I see in 5760 and 5625 and 5772 is all just it doing that benefits calculation for me. So again, it's going to credit that amount from the 5760 object code into, there we go, credit that amount into 5760 from that 10314000 account, and down here it's going to debit it onto the account I moved it onto, the 10311420 in that same object code. So this is all just based on how I've set up my fringe benefit calculations in those tables, but the salary transfer is going to do it for me, because this is pretty complicated stuff, and we don't want end users. I mean, I can calculate it out manually if you give me 5 minutes and a piece of paper. but you know, when folks are doing documents, we sort of assume that you'll want them to move the associated benefits along with the salary here. Now, this is only part of why this is so complex, though. You'll notice that all these object codes appear multiple times. So what's up with that? Well, a lot of these, if you look down the balance type column, are these A2 entries that we talked about, that balance type that's specific to labor. It doesn't really exist anywhere else. Oh, look, I even gave an example of benefits calculation, but we kind of already did one. So I want to move on and talk about the A2 entries while we're thinking about them here. So the salary transfer is going to generate the actual entries that we've seen and the A2 entries for every salary and fringe object code that we're impacting here. So every one of them is going to get both actuals and A2 entries. And as we talked about earlier, the A2 entries kind of preserve the original accounting period of the labor ledger entries. So below is a simplified example of what we saw on our salary transfer with a dollar amount that's a little more round, $100 off of a different object code, in this case 2400, but the same sort of thing applies. The same fiscal period actually that I used in our example, so accounting period 8 and fiscal year 2007, and the same accounts from account 10314000 to account 10314020. So note that one A2 entry for each account will post to fiscal year 2007 and period 8. So we've got one here. If I look at my A2 entries, I've got one that has the fiscal year and the period assigned. So I know when I look back at fiscal period 8 in 2007, I don't want this salary amount to show up as being paid there anymore, because I changed it later on. We're really going to pay it from somewhere else. So this is going to credit that A2 balance off of that specific period. There's another A2 entry, and the AC entry, so the actuals and another A2 entry that post to the period in which the salary transfer gets approved. So the way that this works in KFS, and you'll see this with other docs too, is often the eDocs don't fill in a fiscal year and period. It leaves them blank. And what happens there is part of what the scrubber will do, and it processes entries, is if you don't have a fiscal year and period, it will assign it to the current fiscal year and period. So this prevents you from having, situations where people create a document in one period and it languishes around for months on end and gets posted, later, and you don't want it to post back to that period. You really want it to post to the period that it gets approved in. And so these same entries are back here. On the 20 account, you'll see the same thing. So we get this A2 entry for the fiscal period of 2008 in fiscal year 2007 that's debiting that. And then we'll have these two entries that kind of wash each other out in the current period. So there's no real impact here from these two. But it ends up, I did one line that had 3 different types of benefits, moved it to another account, and you end up with like 3 entries for each. So it does get fairly complex when you're looking at the A2 entries and the AC entries and all the benefit entries. So it can be a little intimidating when you pop open that labor ledger pending entry tab and look at it. But there is sort of a method to the madness here. And I'd mentioned earlier when we were looking at parameters, and I mentioned actually that I think the person I was logged in as was able to change the object code here, and I didn't. But you can see based on those tables that we looked at, the benefit calculation tables, that if I change the object code, now all of a sudden I might have different benefits that are associated with that object code. I might have different rates for those benefits. So now I might have a document that really doesn't balance. I'm moving, $1,000 worth of benefits off here, but if I change this to a different object code and it calculates benefits at a higher rate in that new object code, I might be moving more here. And this goes back to that parameter value that I mentioned earlier. And we do kind of lock this ability down. So if you don't want people to be able to do this, they don't have to be able to do it. There aren't a whole lot of great functional reasons for doing this that I can come up with off of the top of my head. It was something that we'd actually thought about removing from KFS. IU wants to use it because we do some different benefit rates for our contract and grant accounts. We charge them out at a different rate. So we wanted to be able to change it, but we actually thought about, just doing that as an IU specific customization, but it turned out that some other institutions wanted the ability to do it too. So we left it in, but aside from that IU specific example that I'm familiar with, I can't think of a great reason to do it. I suppose you could do a correction just to the object code after the fact, but it would almost make more sense to start that on your payroll side and feed that through rather than just shuffle it around in the financial system. But in any event, if you modify the object code on a salary transfer, just be aware that may result in unbalanced fringe entries. We might have more being generated on that to side or less being generated on the to side of the document than you would have had. And any difference that it does find gets applied to a benefit clearing account that you define in parameters. So we can say, here's my benefit clearing chart of accounts and here's the benefit clearing account number that I want those entries charged to. So any positive or negative, over or under, coming from the salary transfer would end up in one place, and then you could manage that. Do you all have that any situation where you could imagine letting people change it on the salary transfer, the object code? Yeah, like I said, it's really, I would imagine, really rare. So what you could do is just not give that permission to anybody in the system, and you wouldn't have this issue. I've already sort of mentioned this, but just to hit on it again, because if you do decide to use effort certification really works closely with the salary expense transfer. When you generate effort reports for the system, what it does is allows you to say this reporting period starts in this month and ends in this month, and you can run a process that will look through the labor ledger for entries from that month and generate an effort certification document for each individual that had effort during that period on the eligible accounts that you can define in the effort certification module. So it generates this effort report and routes it for people to edit if need be and to approve. And while that's en route, you cannot process a salary transfer for those folks in those periods. It will just stop you cold with an error message. Now there's a permission where you can give people the ability to override that, but functionally, the only purpose I can see to overriding it would be to give it to whoever sort of manages your effort certification, so if there is a problem, they would have the ability to go in and fix it. They would also be the people who would have the ability to do things like recreate effort reports if they needed to, if some problem were preventing the correct effort from being recorded on the original one. So they can override it. But generally, we're locking down the salary transfers for that employee in those periods once that effort certification report is generated and routes. Any changes made to that effort report at that point, so if you say you paid me 100% from one account and really my effort should have been split across a couple accounts for that period, you can go in and make that change on the effort certification report, and that will continue to route and get all the approvals that it needs. And once that is fully approved, KFS will automatically spawn a salary expense transfer document that it blanket approves to make that adjustment, to move half of my salary to the account that you indicated I spent half of my effort on. So the salary expense transfer in that case gets sort of leveraged by effort certification as just a method to modify the labor ledger, to keep it in sync with what we've certified the effort as. Let me talk a little more about effort certification in general and give you maybe a little more about what it does. So we've looked at the salary expense transfer, which would allow you sort of after the fact to move something outside of the payroll system. So I've paid them on this account. Turns out, because of a different start date or because of the number of children involved with this particular piece of the project, I actually need to move some of that salary, should be paid somewhere else. The salary expense transfer will let you do that without having to go back to the payroll system and start. But with the idea being, we paid the person, they got paid right, I don't really need to run them back through payroll. What I need to do is distribute that expense properly on our side. And effort certification kind of takes that one step forward or one step further and says for anybody being paid on grant accounts, especially federal grant accounts, I want to do a couple things. First, I want to make sure that whoever's responsible for this project, sort of project director for the grant account, has the opportunity to see and verify how the effort is being spent against their project. And the effort report sort of grew out of the A21 reporting requirement. It's A21's a federal circular for reporting, effort, especially on federal grant accounts, and institutions often get to the point where they have to also report even on non-federal grant funding. And so what the effort report allows you to do is it's really a way to even further control, to kind of further lock down that the ability for people to change where salaries show up after the fact. So one part of it that folks like is that it does lock down. Once that effort report's created, I can no longer shuffle that salary around. Now before that, I can correct it with the salary expense transfer, but once that effort report's created, it locks it down. And even after that effort report is certified, if I want to modify that salary, I can no longer just go do a salary transfer, because we've certified that this effort was reflected correctly on the right accounts. So there's an A21 recreate process at that, and the idea being the bar is set kind of higher because we've certified it. You've said, you know, this is really how we spent the effort. I mean, in reality, what happens is we have a lot of people who, you know, have to go back and something was wrong or we didn't quite get the effort right, and we do these recreates which spawn salary transfers. So to me, it seems like the effort certification module is really helpful in terms of sort of a compliance aspect, but I'm not sure that you all have that issue. But if you do any kind of A21 effort reporting now for federal grants?
We do.
Okay.
We do it manually.
Okay, and I guess it's a matter of, you know, is the volume that you do enough to merit using the effort certification module? It would certainly be, I think and I'm a little out of my element here in talking about effort certification, but I believe there's a way that, like, similar to some of the labor parameters we saw, where you can say, I only want to generate effort reports for employees that have effort on a grant that I've identified as federal. So if it's federal, I want to do it. If it's non-federal, I don't want to do it. So you can kind of control if it's something where I don't want to create effort reports for everybody on campus because that's not going to help us. Well, I need to do it for this small group of people that are paid from these particular accounts. You could do that, and that would be a way to do that electronically. We used to do ours on paper too. We'd just do paper certifications. You know, we'd send them out and ask people to sign them and send them back and say, you know, certify that this person worked 25% on this project and 75% from the department, you know, on the department account teaching or doing other services or whatever, and sign that and send it back to us, and we would file it. And all the effort report really does is it makes that an electronic document, and it kind of adds this additional control to keep people from monkeying with the numbers after that certification has happened. So it might be something to look a little more at. I'm not sure what kind of volume you'd have, but it would be, it meshes really pretty easily with the labor distribution module.
So it's an entirely separate module?
It is. It is a separate module, so you can use labor and not use effort. It doesn't go the other way. You really need, if you're using effort, you really have to have labor because it's going to read labor. But yeah, if you can decide to use labor and not to use effort, you just wouldn't generate the effort reports. It wouldn't lock down anything, and you could just leave that part alone. Okay, thank you. Okay, is everybody braked and refreshed and good to go? I think I've got a little more here to talk about, and then we should have a nice chunk of time at the end just to talk about whatever other questions you all might have or things you'd like to see in some more detail. So I did want to we talked about the salary expense transfer a little bit. I wanted to talk about another EDOC that's in the labor module, which is the benefit expense transfer. And this is very similar to the salary expense transfer. The difference is it's just to move benefits. If you have a situation where for some reason I don't want to move salary, I only want to move benefits, which is probably more rare, certainly in my experience, much more rare than doing the salary transfers, which are also moving the benefits. But if you want to, you can just move benefits from one place to another. In this case, we're selecting by fiscal year and account, so I'm putting those values in. And I think maybe sub-account too, but I can choose object code and accounting period in addition to those. It's very similar in terms of edits to the salary transfer. I can choose to move an amount that's equal to or less than the balance that exists in that period that I've selected. And I can move multiple accounting periods as well. The system kind of assumes that you won't necessarily have your benefit information in by person. So it doesn't require you, when I do a benefit expense transfer here, to select a person. I can just pick an account. So it's chart, account, and you can go down to the sub-account level if you want to select as part of your selection criteria here. So just to show you, it's very similar to the way the salary transfer was laid out. I've got the overview section with my description and my explanation. Those ledger balance importing, where I'm really going to find the benefits that I want to pull out, and then the accounting lines that it will build for me as I pull that information out of the labor ledger. So let me find fringe benefit balance we could move. out here. Now this is consolidated information really because I'm not, we haven't populated the labor ledger fringe benefit object codes with position numbers or names, so I'm not getting that level of detail here. Position numbers just kind of dashed out. But I do get still my monthly buckets for each. The accounting string here that would let me pick. Really the benefit transfer is a simpler document in a lot of ways than the salary expense transfer document, because we're not worrying about generating those extra entries for benefits. We're not doing that benefit calculation where we saw all the additional rows created in the salary expense transfer. So I'm just selecting a particular period and returning it. And it's going to build that from side line for me like it did previously with my chart, my account, my object code. It is noting what pay period or what accounting period this relates to for payroll, what fiscal year it relates to, and gives me the dollar amount. Again, I can change this to any amount that's less than this if I really just want to move $1,000 of benefits from this object code to somewhere else. And then I just click this copy button, and that'll generate the two-side line for me and allow me to go in and make whatever account or sub-account changes I want here. Object code, not really locked down here. You could change that. Again, less of an issue on the benefit transfer since we're not generating fringe benefits based on this object code. You won't get into that situation where we talked about on the salary transfer, where I might have one benefit rate for one object code and a different benefit rate for another. But really, I think commonly it's just used in the event that that we need to move benefits wholesale from one account to another, which, as I mentioned earlier, functionally is kind of rare, at least for us at IU. I don't see a lot of use out of the benefit expense transfer document. But it is there if you just want to move benefits, and if I submit it, we'll see it generates similar A2 entries and AC entries to the salary transfer, but not quite as complex. Oops, you know what I forgot to do? I forgot to put in my description. Again, it's a really bad description, please note. One, we discourage users from putting in bad description. So I'll just go ahead and submit that guy, and we'll. So much more like what you might expect to see out of pending ledger entries, just the A2 entries that are crediting it on the 10-31400 account, and the ones debiting it on the 20 account that I moved it to. So a real similar document in terms of the way it functions. And really the labor documents are kind of the only ones in Kuali that work like this, where they require you to go in and kind of find something before you can manipulate it. So labor just kind of unique to labor. A little bit about just kind of the default workflow for these documents. Sort of the default setting for both of them is they both route to the fiscal officer for the account first. They do what we call, now the name of this changes for like every KFS release, but it's organization, accounting, routing. So if you say for this particular organization or unit, I want all salary transfers to route through this particular person and they need to approve it, this allows you to set that kind of optional by department workflow for these documents. If you have particular sub-funds that you want to be approved by other users, that's available as well. And if you're doing for contracts and grant accounts, there's a way to tie the grant account to a particular contract and grant processor for approval. So I'm not sure how many of those are really ones you all would be interested in, but really the fiscal officer one is kind of the key one in my opinion. You want the person who's responsible for the financial side of the the account to know what's going to happen, because they'll hit labor, but then they will feed the general ledger. So you'll see real balance updates related to them as well. So that's just kind of how they route out of the can, so to speak. I showed you some labor reports. I want to talk a little bit more about the labor inquiries that are available. And this is a place where we're going to see some of those fields we talked about earlier, like the CSF fields. I think we already kind of looked at the Calculated Salary Foundation report, but there are a couple account status ones. There's one that includes some base budget information, which would be coming from budget construction. If you're using that, you all, I don't know many schools that are planning to use budget construction. Have you all had? You're going to use it? Okay, great. I didn't know that. Great, good. Have company. So some of this would be fed from budget construction. So there's one that's base funds. There's one that's more kind of skewed towards showing the current funds, the year-to-date actuals, and outstanding encumbrances. So I'm going to kind of split these up a little bit. Hop out here and just look at a couple. So there's a couple out here under labor that are these account status ones. I'll just show you the difference between the base fund one and the current one. Again, I'm going to go back in the test data to where I know we have some labor data. And this one's really the base funds that we're looking at now. It's by account and by object code. It's not really by person, so it's kind of a high level view. But it'll give you basically what was the budget amount for each of these labor object codes, the base budget. So if we're tracking base budget and current budget, and it'll track that CSF amount. So again, based on how we're paying people and then feeding that CSF information in, what do we think we're going to end up paying these people based on how we've got them funded now. And it can help you find problems with this variance column. So we basically say, well, here's what we thought we were doing with our base budget. And this adjusted base budget would take into account any adjustments that you might have done to this year's budget using like a budget adjustment, and just do sort of simple subtraction across. So you can find places where you have negatives and maybe investigate what that's about. You can also drill into these amounts if you want, especially here on the CSF. You can't drill into the base budget, but you can drill in here and get more information about what makes that up. So this is where you could get the person detail. Again, I'm kind of missing my people names in the test data now, but if I wanted to see, wow, where does that big number come from? What are all the amounts that were set up to pay here on this account and object code? This would do it for me. So this is kind of a connection over to back to that CSF tracker report where it shows me the July 1 budget amount, the FTE, and the CSF, the Calculated Salary Foundation amount, and the full-time effort there. So, yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
So on your position number,
Yes.
that assumes that you have that one person is making 157,000, right? And it ties to one position, so you couldn't have two people with that same position number?
You sure could.
Oh, you could?
They would just show up, right, because this is, and it's a little unclear here because we're missing the person, which would be
Okay,
another
so you
field we
have-
could, so you could be in this row with this position number, and I could be in this row with the same position number, and we'd just be, so
Would
it
our
is
amounts have been
possible.
separated?
Yes,
Okay.
they would have been separated. So again, it's all based on how you're feeding information into the labor ledger. So if you've decided up front, we're going to have one position per person, then you wouldn't see that. But if you've decided, for our position management, we can have multiple, I can associate more than one person with a position, then what you'll see here is it keyed really by person and position. And we have that situation too, because we have a lot of folks who are in, we have more than one person in the same position. We have more than one head count in the same position. So we would want to look here. If I sorted it by position, I would want to pay attention to who's assigned to that position too.
So the CSF amount, that's budget, that's not actual pay.
Well, this is actually, let's talk about CSF again because it's one of those kind of slippery concepts. The Calculated Salary Foundation is basically what my full year funding amount is now. So let's say that you hire me and you give me a July 1 budget amount of $106,384 first, thank you, because that's a lot of money. And then later in the year, let's say you give me a raise, and now I'm making 120. So now my July 1 budget will be 106,384, but if I'm updating this CSF information, that's going to show what my calculated salary foundation, how much I'm going to get paid for the year. So it's really neither. It's not quite your budget, and it's not quite what you're going to pay me, because you might have paid me for 3 months already before I got the raise. But it's really trying to capture that sort of whole year number. Yeah, it's kind of a projection, really. It's right. It's really information that you can leverage, and it's handy for things like, looking at this. Oh, we didn't budget this guy, but now he's got some CSF, so we've got some funding related to this account.
Would you say it's the remaining commitment for the fiscal year for that?
I would say it would be the whole commitment for a fiscal year based on what they're paid now. So if I was So this 106,384 here doesn't necessarily mean I've been paid that whole amount. It means that's what my salary is calculated at for that fiscal year now.
So the example where the highlighter's on right now. So
Yes.
we didn't start July 1, there was no budget, there was no
Right.
presentation of that position, but something happened
Right.
for the 13,924, and that's for the entire year.
Right. And so that, and this would reflect that, well, that's not my full salary, because that's only part of it, and the rest of it, because remember, I'm looking at this by account. I sort of came into this by account, so the rest of this is probably elsewhere.
So when you think about the encumbrance system, let's say, in that case, you probably want to encumber, right? Because there was no encumbrance on July 1.
Well, that's a good point. So when I create, so let's say, and this would be true, and this is true even if it's not a new person, right? But when I start a new fiscal year, and one of the things I would want to do is I would want to set up encumbrances for the people in my labor ledger, right? So Keiko, I'm going to pay you $106,384 this fiscal year. So I would want to set up that $106,384 encumbrance so that as I pay you throughout the year, I can reduce that down, and at any point match my, what I've paid you plus my outstanding encumbrance, and come up with 106,384. Now, the important point to go back to from earlier is that the labor ledger doesn't do that encumbrance calculation for you. It's going to accept transactions, but it's not going to adjust the encumbrance down for you. So when I pay Keiko $10,000 this month, I'll need to send 2 entries into the labor ledger. I would need to send an actual entry to debit $10,000. I'm paying her that money, so I want that actual entry in. I'll also need to send an encumbrance entry in. That's kind of the flip side of that. That says, well, I want to credit encumbrances by $10,000 on that account, because I'm relieving that encumbrance. I'm paying her that. I no longer owe that to her. So throughout the year, my actual should keep going up, my encumbrance should keep going down, and at any point I should be able to add the two together and come up with a pretty good number of what I'll end up paying Keiko on this particular account that fiscal year. But the important part to remember is that labor doesn't look at that actual entry and generate an encumbrance. It's relying on an external feed to say that encumbrance needs to be reduced now. Or, hey, we hired this person mid-year, I need to set up a new encumbrance to pay Keiko maybe half that amount for December through June.
IU, where you do the calculation, is PeopleSoft side?
We do the calculation on the PeopleSoft side. That's correct. So IU uses PeopleSoft for HR and payroll. So our payroll, when they send me entries, they send me actuals and they send me encumbrances, and I balance both to make sure.
Do they also adjust the encumbrance based upon the CSF throughout the year?
Right. Well, the CSF should be getting its information from the funding and the job. So if I get a raise, you would expect the CSF to go up, and we would also expect the next time that encumbrances are adjusted. What we do anyway for encumbrances is every time that we run a payroll for that type of employee, we do any encumbrance adjustments that have happened to that employee at that time. So if you're paid monthly, for example, and we give you a raise in the middle of the month, it doesn't happen, you won't see that reflected overnight in the system because we just choose to send it the next time we run a monthly payroll. We'll have that entry generated at the same time and send it through. We actually had trouble with that, so now we're doing it twice a month for monthlies because they ended up being too long. No, they wouldn't use CSF because they're, again, the HR payroll system is the source of record in that, so it knows what my real rate of pay is, and the CSF should be adjusting based on that. And I know the CSF gets leveraged some for budget construction, and we use it. You know, it's handy here when we're looking at reports, but this information should relate back to what I've got in my payroll system. So that tells me, but it's a one-way street. CSF isn't telling payroll and HR anything that it doesn't already know. What it's trying to do is give you some idea of the financial implications of what the salary setup is. Yeah.
Your example where you said you start out July 1st with 106,000.
Yeah.
Let's say you get a raise mid-year.
Yeah.
To 150,000, and then.
Right.
For 3 months you had the 106,000 salary rate.
Right.
9 months you have 150,000. So let's say it comes out to 130,000.
Yeah.
Do you see 130 on the CSF amount, or do you see the 150?
I would see 150
Oh,
on the CSF amount. Now there are other places where we'll go where we would see the 130, so I'll point those out to you on some of the other queries. But here, it's really kind of this is a little more, a little more removed from the actuals. Actually, that's a good question. Yes, so we're looking at, and I'm not exactly sure what convolutions it goes through on the PeopleSoft side to get it. But there's, and for us it happens in our budget. Our university budget office owns the CSF tracker. So they update it based on feeds from PeopleSoft, but it's based on the salary information that we relate to jobs on the PeopleSoft side. That's right. It's really coming from like job data is really what it's coming from, because I'm not going to be sending a labor ledger entry for the full salary amount at any time, except maybe an encumbrance maybe at the beginning of the year, but it really is. Yeah, and it's the one part that I'm not all that familiar with how we populate it, because it is sort of tied to the budget construction realm, but yeah, that's my understanding, is that we're getting that from the HR payroll system, and then it becomes, it is a nice guide as you're looking at these numbers. You can see, well, why am I off somewhere? And we start looking at labor, and we can see, well, we planned on paying Keiko $106,000, but now look, for the full year, her salary amount has jumped to $150,000 for the full year. Just she's happy, but I'm confused. Chuck?
I think the point there, though, too, is if the school does not have a robust interface between their HR payroll system, they could use that CSF figure to do all their budgetary perspective, all their estimates of what a position actually will cost them next year.
It is handy to that. Right. Mm-hmm.
Maybe salary levels based on new hiring.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's feeding, basically, it's a way for me, if I'm not a user of the HR payroll system, to have some visibility for, what that full year number is.
So at Delta though, are you planning on feeding anything? Oh, I mean, the decision may not be made, but is that possible to feed, let's say, conferences from payroll system?
We were talking about that we have a couple little things in there. We don't know what we're going to do. I mean, this is the first time I saw it. You have multiple people per position. So we have that
Yeah.
question on both sides. Can we store multiple people? And then what would we do with our short-term people, or does it not care? Or, eventually they're going to come over as expenditures, so you'll need them you'll care at that time.
Yeah.
You may not care about the encumbrances, but you might want to care about adjunct faculty encumbrances. So,
Yeah.
we'd like to, but it depends when we get to question and answer time, what fields, what data do you need loaded?
Well, you don't need to, I mean, to sort of answer specific to that topic, you don't need position number. You don't need name. The labor ledger is it will take what you are willing to give it. So the best part, I mean, what you need is sort of the accounting key. I can essentially turn around and feed GL entries into the labor ledger. Don't do it, but you could, because it's sort of, those are the fields that it really requires. So
If you didn't have a position number, then wouldn't all that stuff for the same account number be all lumped up into one you'd have?
it sure would. And if that's not okay for you, then you need to send the labor ledger, position number, and person. But there's no internal logic to KFS that's going to say you can't feed that entry into the labor ledger because I've already associated this position number with this person. There's no association in KFS between position number and person. It's only based on the data that you feed it. So if you say these 4 people are 4 different people with these entries and they all have the same position number, then you'll see that when you report, but KFS won't stop you. As far as it's concerned, your position structure is your business. It just has a table that you can feed in, so when you click on this little guy, you can get something other than that crazy error message that I got. But you know, that's really what, it's there for your reference. So I think the labor ledger is flexible enough to do whatever you want to do with positions. And now we did talk a little earlier about that it would be worth asking the question about budget construction. Is budget construction keying off of certain things in positions? And I'm sure you can have multiple people in the same positions, but there might be some implications to, you know, to how your positions are set up and your people are set up on the budget construction side. So that would be a question to.
If you don't populate it, let's say the full position, and if you don't assign an employee ID, you can't really do a budget transfer then, budget salary transfer, right? Because you can't really pull that through.
Right. You would want to do it by person. Yeah, you would want to be able to do it. Right. Right, and these are, yeah. So the person would be associated with an employee
The only
ID.
way you would do a transfer would be from a GL side for those full positions that we don't have.
Well, you could do it without a position number. You just couldn't do it without a person.
That may be a person.
Yeah, because we've got to say fiscal year in person on that salary transfer when I go in. But if I don't have a position, it'll just put dashes in there. So.
So I would say it was 22 fields that would do a collapsing of the the object code and the account number.
Right.
That would be the key fields, I would think. Right?
I mean, I like, you know, and labor's really, I mean, think about what you've got. You've got employee ID, you've got position number. Both are nice. You know, employee ID you really need. If you're not going to send employee ID, just send it into the general ledger. You've got position number, which is really nice for tying back to your position management wherever that's done. You've got things like the earn code that we talked about earlier. So this is an entry for regular work hours versus sick time versus vacation time, which are things you could then leverage reports for the financial impact of those. It's called an earn code. So that's a handy one if you want to be able, when we talked earlier about leveraging data out of the system based on those particular earn codes. How much am I spending on, you know, sick time or vacation time, or these different codes that you've defined in your payroll system. So those are, you know, when I try to think back to sort of reporting that I've done out of the labor ledger, by person and by position and by earn code are really handy. Now there's a lot of other data in there, but just in terms of utility, those are
You're able to
pretty
create
nice.
your own reports out of labor ledger, and you as a functional user?
I pull them out of my data warehouse, or, but yeah, I mean you can, but we can get to that kind of data here. Let me go. Let me show you some of these other ones, and we can come back and talk a little bit more about all these. But let's just look at some of these other reports too, so you've got a kind of a general idea what else is out here. This one is account status current funds, as opposed to the base one that we just looked at. Very similar. I'm going to run it for the same criteria. And we'll check this one out.
And this checks the accounts from KFS.
It does check the accounts from KFS, and it's similar, but this is the one that gets to kind of the current year information that you were asking about earlier. So here's my July 1 budget. my year-to-date actual for that person. So what I've passed into the labor ledger entries and actuals for this person year-to-date.
Do you pass it in both ways, both to the labor ledger and to the general ledger?
You pass it into the labor ledger, and then the labor ledger will consolidate those entries down and pass it to the general ledger. So I wouldn't feed anything directly from my payroll system into the general ledger. Well, and that's probably, there may be some entries for things that we don't want in the general or in
So
the labor
corrections,
ledger.
even past historical corrections will have to go through labor ledger, and then it gets switched over.
Right. I would, if I can fix it on the labor ledger side, I would fix it on the labor ledger side and let it flow through to the general ledger. And that way you only have to touch it in one place and don't have to worry.
Changes what happened in the ledger, as opposed, you don't really change it in payroll, because they don't really care what account.
Well, you know, in my world, I would want to change it in both places. So now I've got two problems. Well, we're paying Bob on the wrong account. We've been paying him on the wrong account for 3 months. Well, what do we need to do first? Well, let's fix payroll so we don't pay him on the wrong account again this month. And then I'll go in and I can do a salary transfer document, and then that'll move the labor ledger entries to the right account for the last 3 months. So usually it's not just one or the other. It's usually really, if it's an ongoing problem, you want to fix the root of it, and then just use the KFS docs to fix what's posted incorrectly so far. So it's a good question. It happens all the time. I mean, people will call me and say, why is this guy getting paid on this account? Because he's been getting paid on that account for a year and nobody's changed it.
And because labor ledger doesn't care about encumbrances, like you said earlier, the encumbrances come from the payroll system, correct? So
Right.
if you correct the account in the payroll system, the next time you feed in, it'll carry that current encumbrance in.
Right. You would hope that that you can do that part on the payroll side, so that if and again, I mean, that you have to, I guess, figure out how your HR payroll system would do that. But I mean, like, I know kind of generally what ours, when I hire somebody, it creates a new encumbrance for them based on how much of the fiscal year we have left to pay them and the rate that we've set up. And when I do something like give them a raise, it knows to generate. But that's all happening on the payroll HR side, being fed in. And then KFS does a couple things. I mean, it posts it to the labor ledger, it scrubs it all to make sure it's valid, and it consolidates it down and posts it to the general ledger. So you've got, when you're looking at your accounts and trying to figure out how much money you've got left, you've got an accurate encumbrance amount sitting in the general ledger too. So yeah, but the thinking is that needs to come over from a payroll or HR system that would be kind of the authority on what needs to be paid to this person from now until the end of the fiscal year. And this one's kind of nice because it allows you to sort of drill down into these different numbers. Now, the July 1 budget amount is just kind of static here, but I can drill into the year-to-date actuals or the outstanding encumbrances and see what makes up those entries. So I just clicked on the actual amount. So this is the monthly breakdown of actual expenses related to this object code for this particular person. Again, my employee name's not showing up like it should, but I should see the actual name here to make it a little clearer what I'm looking at. And you get the same kind of thing when you drill into encumbrances. You can see here I had the big encumbrance come through in July. And in August, I reduced it by a pretty hefty amount for some reason. And then since then, I've sort of reduced it by the same amount every month. Pretty much as I pay them, I reduce this down. And you can keep going. I mean, like other KFS balance inquiries, I can keep drilling into this little guy here and see, is this one entry? Is it two? Where's it coming from? So this is the actual labor ledger detail entry, which is really, really long. But this is like the one we looked at earlier where it does have, the employee ID and the payroll fiscal period and year end date. I'd mentioned earlier we use that run identifier. That's a payroll run ID right out of our payroll system. We just use it to tie as another way to kind of tie that entry back to payroll. So this one gives you a little bit of the budget information, some information about who we're talking about on this account, and the year-to-date actual, the outstanding encumbrance, and it'll calculate a variance for you too. So am I off somewhere? I mean, you would hope that it would all wash out to zero, right? So my budget, I budgeted 64,460. So far I've paid 58,014. I've got 64,46 outstanding encumbered, and if I pay that, I'm done. My budget minus my actual plus encumbrances is zero. Obviously, some of our data is less than perfect out here, but that's the kind of stuff you would look for to say, well, wait a minute, why am I going to be $25,000 over what we budgeted? And it could be one of those things, well, maybe we changed their rate mid-year, or maybe I was funding that, planning during budgeting to fund that on another account, and now I'm funding it on this account. So maybe it wasn't really budgeted here to begin with. But these are the kind of things that the labor reports can sort of help you puzzle out and catch problems. So we've looked at base funds, we looked at current funds, which has more of that fiscal year actual and encumbrance stuff. We looked at the calculated salary foundation a little bit earlier and kind of through the account status base funds, but we'll pull it up one more time just to make sure. This is the one again that's going to show us the July 1 budget, the July 1 budget FTE, and the actual CSF amount and the CSF FTE. So again, sort of the difference between what I was planning on for the fiscal year and given the rate that they're being paid at now, what would the impact be for a whole year now, or what would the full-time equivalent be if we started off thinking we were going to pay them 100% on this account. Is it changed? Is it now like one of these two where we weren't planning on paying them anything on this account, and now we've got a CSF amount and a CSF FTE amount to indicate we're paying part of their full-time equivalency here. Some of the other ones that we haven't seen yet, let's go back here and see. Employee funding is nice. I use this one a lot as well, and this is one where you can do it by employee. You can do it by employee. You have to do it by employee in fiscal year. You can also choose just to view certain accounts for a particular employee if that's important. Let me just pull up one of these employees we've been looking at here. And this one's kind of I'll make this a little tinier. I kind of blew it up earlier. So this is my name thing is still being a problem, but I would have the person's name and their ID number here, the fiscal year, the sort of accounting string along with their position number, some of that CSF information that we saw, including the amount and the status and the full-time equivalency, and then the current amount and the encumbrance amount and the total amount. So it's kind of similar to the account status current that we looked at, except it's by person. Here I'm saying, I don't, the report I ran, I don't care what account it is. Show me every account for this person. Show me all of their information together. And so I can look and see if they're getting paid on object codes that maybe I didn't plan on them getting paid on. I can do the same kind of comparison that we were talking about before between, what's my current amount and my encumbrance amount. How does that compare in this case to my CSF amount, which we talked about some of the reasons you might see a difference there. The total amount just adds up your current amount plus your encumbrance amount. But this is often the place where I would go when somebody calls me and says, I'm trying to figure out what we've paid this guy. Well, let's go here and I can tell you all the accounts that we've paid him on and all the object codes. It's just a little easier way to go at it when you're doing things by person. You kind of get all your accounting strings in a row here. Hop back and show. We just got a couple more here. Some of these are going to be pulling budget information, like this is the July 1 position funding by account. Oops, forgot to change my fiscal year. So this is really just getting at the budget information by account. And actually, if I had to pick a labor report that is like the least labor report of all the labor reports, it's probably this one, because it's really more of a budget report. I mean, we're looking at labor information. It's about people's salaries by object code, but it's really more about pulling in some of that budget information that we've seen. And I believe if you're using budget construction, you're going to be pulling most of this information from budget construction. It's not really related to entries that I'm passing into the labor ledger so much as it is to budget data that I have by person and by position. So really a little more limited, I think, than some of the other ones that we looked at. Hop over one. Now the labor ledger view, this is the one I think Keiko asked about earlier and we looked at, where I can do it by person and see, whereas the employee funding kind of consolidates everything for me and says, well, here's what we've paid year to date for this person and here's what we have encumbered. The labor ledger view is going to give me that kind of monthly breakdown that we've seen elsewhere. So this is basically the screen you go to when you do that salary transfer and say, hey, I want to move somebody's salary. It's really the labor ledger view that you go to. What accounting string they've been paid on, how did we split that up over the different months, and you can get down into the details of any one of these by just clicking on it, and it'll take us back to that labor ledger entry view where we're just seeing basically the whole string that we passed into the labor ledger that generated that monthly balance amount that we're seeing here. And again, some options for balance types. I can choose to see those A2 balance types or internal encumbrances if I want to. I'm sure what we have out here for encumbrances, but I just switched it to encumbrances and ran it again, and I see the same kind of thing that we saw earlier where I'm setting up, see the encumbrance set up in July and sort of gradually coming off as the year goes on. So sort of getting credited throughout the year. Let's see, we'll look at just a couple more here real quick. The labor ledger pending entry, this is just a way to look at pending entries in KFS eDocs, really. Let's see if I can find the salary transfer I did earlier. Should probably be out here. Other folks might be out here in test doing some things as well. Oh, you know what I got to do? Take my fiscal period code off and try that again. No, maybe not. Thought I submitted those. Let's see. I'm going to cheat and take, I know why. It's my fiscal year. Let's do this. As far as KFS is concerned, those are actually 2009 documents. So these are entries from just labor documents that are that haven't been posted yet. So they still have pending ledger entries out in KFS. These would be things like salary transfers that you created today and routed. They could even be fully approved salary transfers, but if we haven't done the batch processing that posts things to labor, they'll still be considered pending, which basically just means when you're looking at balances, unless you specifically ask for pending ledger entries to be included, you're not seeing the impact of these entries. And this is a really big report. You can narrow it down 10, 20 different ways, by any of the accounting fields that you want, by fiscal period, by document type, even by document number or employee ID or position number. So if I want to see all the pending entries related to a particular person, I could do that.
But you can't multi-select, like you couldn't select one account number with two object codes,
That's probably true. I don't think it'll let you use, there are some, there's a list of wildcards somewhere and the different ways you can use them in lookups. I think you can do ranges, I think, and you may be able to do multiple values maybe with the ampersand, but I wouldn't swear to that. It's a good question. Somewhere I've got and we were actually going to put it in, it'll be in the lookup help eventually is where it'll end up, but there's sort of a list of allowable wildcards and examples. There's one out here, not in test, but if you look at like the Kuali test drive where there's a full sort of help implementation there online, you can see some advice for using wildcards behind this little question mark guy here next to the name of the lookup. The last one is just position inquiry. And again, we talked a little bit about this, but you can see this is what's in the position table. Here is position number, an effective date, a description, a business unit, which may or may not mean anything to you in terms of position management, like a department ID, which in the base data here is sort of a chart and organization concatenated together. A salary plan coming from an HR system, a grade coming from an HR payroll system, the full-time equivalency of that position, a job code that relates to that position, a position status, active or inactive. I think we pull it over more frequently than that, but I'm not sure. I can't remember if it's, yeah, yeah. I mean, we do keep inactive position data in here, so it updates. But yeah, we'll just update that from our HR payroll system. So I would still be able to see inactive or old positions, which is especially handy when you're looking at old labor data and I want to open up the position details for something that was older. There's also a position funding drill down here. Let's see how that. Now the problem here is actually finding. I think this. What about this one? So, and this ties back to the CSF data by position number. So it'll give you the accounts and the object codes, the CSF amounts, the fiscal years. So it's kind of handy. I can look and see, and this would actually give me the names. What this is really nice for is if you've had, a position that's changed hands several times, you could look here and see, how did we fund each of those people? What fiscal years were they associated with? You can kind of look and see all of that information. But that's really relying on that CSF data. So again, that funding information that was coming over from payroll or HR. But there's really there's no interface to really edit positions in KFS. And if I drill into one of these, I think there are some additional fields as well. Oh, no, maybe not. I think there might be. Keiko, aren't there more fields than just what you see here in the position table, or is this it? Yeah. I think there are more here. I'm having trouble drilling into something which may be just a bug in C&V now because I've seen that a couple times today. But I thought there were some.
Get the list of fields and have some stuff that you have loaded feature tables like the position table and that employee thing.
Well, I think there are some additional ones just to.
Yeah, there was it's called CS permission data.
Yeah. Some
You'll be able to tell us how often you
kooky.
guys load it.
Yeah, I will. Let me check because I don't think it's nightly, but I think it's more frequently than monthly.
The system is going to be similar to yours, it's a outside external payroll.
Right,
system.
we're just feeding in that table.
Is there a general ledger system associated at all with PeopleSoft?
Not that I know of, no.
So how do they validate the account?
They've written something to validate some kind of sort of scrubber against our chart of accounts, right? Against our chart
Go over to
tables.
exactly that, PFS?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So we could do that, you just wouldn't allow
Yeah.
us.
Well, and that's okay because one of the things we talked about earlier is even if you send invalid, so if I send an invalid account number, I send entries with invalid chart data, when it comes into labor, it'll go through what we call the labor scrubber process. So the scrubber will look at it and say, hey, this account doesn't exist. I'm going to kick that one out as an error. So it will, and then you will get an error file that includes all the ones that it couldn't post because of the account number. And you can use there's the labor ledger correction process document. I can pull that up and say, wherever it says this account in this file, I need to change it to this account and post it back. So even if you don't have that on the payroll side, the worst case is you just have somebody go in and use that correction process to fix it, and you would post it just the next
Right,
day.
and both correct it on the post. But because
Right.
Munis has a chart of account system loaded on, attached to Munis.
Okay.
They have to be valid, they have to be a valid account number.
Okay, so
Otherwise
you've got to
it will-
validate it against that.
Yeah, against a second database account number.
Okay.
So that otherwise it will halt the payroll process.
Okay. So yeah, you could, so if you had, I mean, so KFS sounds a little less draconian in terms of what it would, you could pass it and it would say, hey, that's an error, but it gives you, there are multiple ways then to deal with that entry.
But all the rest of it sounds like it would be similar to what you say that you have on your system.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we do some, my payroll people do, and we still occasionally, they're very rare, but I do occasionally get some errors that fall out of labor. And it tends to be when somebody changed something in the financial system between when payroll did their checking. And so it's not, certainly not unheard of, even when that system is doing the checking for you, to have some occasional problems drop out.